Welcome. The world outside your window has finally quieted, surrendering to the heavy, comforting blanket of the night. Let your shoulders drop, releasing the accumulated tension of the day as your breathing slows to a gentle, steady rhythm. You are entirely safe here, insulated from the rushing demands of the modern era. Tonight we are journeying backward, far away from the glowing screens and the mechanical hum of cities, to a time where the world moved at the deliberate, patient pace of nature itself. The year is 1895. We find ourselves high in the majestic cradle of the Swiss Alps, where the air is unimaginably crisp, carrying the faint scent of pure snow. Close your eyes and allow the darkness to hold you. Imagine the soft, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots against a pristine, undisturbed layer of powder. The sky above is a canvas of the deepest velvet indigo, scattered with a million brilliant, unblinking stars, casting a silver luminescent glow across the jagged, sleeping peaks. The silence here is profound, yet it is not empty. It is a rich, living stillness, punctuated only by the occasional distant whisper of the high-altitude wind slipping through the sleeping evergreens. Breathe in the cool, purifying air. Let it wash over your thoughts, clearing away the clutter. We are about to step into the tranquil, solitary world of an Alpine ice cutter, working beneath the protective gaze of the midnight moon. Let go and drift softly away. Now, before we walk further into this frozen, timeless valley, take a brief moment to settle even deeper into your warm sanctuary. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys through the forgotten corridors of history, consider joining our peaceful community. By subscribing to this channel, you ensure that a calm, gentle escape is always waiting for you at the end of a long and weary day. Liking this video acts like a soft lantern in the dark, guiding other restless souls toward this haven of rest. Perhaps you might gently tap the notification bell, allowing our future stories to arrive softly at your door like a quiet letter from an old, familiar friend. There is no rush here, no urgency to act quickly. Just a serene invitation to return whenever you need to be transported far away. As you lay there, tucked away from the cold, know that your presence here is deeply valued and genuinely appreciated. We build these tranquil soundscapes and historical retreats specifically for your peace of mind, so let your eyes remain heavy. Let the subtle, soothing resonance of my voice guide you downward into sleep. The ice cutter is waiting for us by the frozen lake, his lantern glowing amber against the deep blue shadows of the pine forest. The journey begins now. Breathe deep and simply listen to the quiet past unfold beautifully before your resting mind. Rest now. Let the gentle story take hold of your spirit. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep well. Let us step gently from the sheltering canopy of the ancient pine forest, leaving behind the deep, velvety shadows cast by trees that have stood sentinel over this valley for centuries. As we emerge into the open, the world expands into an endless, breathtaking expanse of silver and slate. Before us lies the great Alpine lake, transformed by the deep winter freeze into a flawless, sleeping mirror. The surface of this frozen sea stretches outward, completely undisturbed, meeting the base of the colossal, slumbering mountains that encircle the water. The moonlight, unhindered by any passing cloud, bathes the entire valley in a cool, ethereal luminescence. This light is not harsh, but incredibly soft, painting the landscape in endless, subtle shades of pearl, pale blue, and deep charcoal. Notice how the beams of the moon catch the very edges of the pine needles we just brushed past. Each individual needle is encased in a delicate, fragile sheath of rime ice, and as the moonlight strikes them, they glimmer with the faint, prismatic glow of crushed diamonds. The air here is extraordinarily still, possessing a clarity that only exists at such extreme altitudes. When you inhale, the breath feels profoundly clean, carrying the most delicate, subtle fragrance of frozen sap and ancient, chilled granite. It is an aroma that instantly clears the mind, anchoring you completely to this exact, quiet moment in time. Look down at the ground beneath your feet. We are not merely walking on snow. We are treading upon a complex, microscopic masterpiece crafted by the winter atmosphere. The powder here has not been touched by the warming rays of the sun for days, preserving its immaculate crystalline structure. If you were to kneel and scoop a handful of this snow, you would notice it does not clump or bind together. It is completely dry, shifting through your woolen mittens like fine, cold sand. Each individual flake is a tiny geometric wonder, maintaining its perfect, intricate points and branches. As our heavy, leather-bound boots press down, the snow yields with a deeply satisfying rhythmic sound, a soft, muted compression that echoes faintly across the open expanse. It is a slow, hypnotic cadence, perfectly synchronized with the steady, relaxed beating of your own heart. With every step, a tiny cloud of crystalline dust rises into the moonlight, hanging suspended in the breathless air for a long, beautiful moment before settling back onto the untouched surface. The texture of the ground feels solid, reliable, and deeply comforting, offering a firm foundation upon which we can safely wander through this midnight sanctuary. Resting near the edge of this vast frozen canvas is a small, solitary structure. It is the ice cutter's warming hut, a humble yet incredibly sturdy architectural marvel, designed to withstand the crushing weight of Alpine winters. The cabin is constructed entirely from thick hand-hewn logs of local larch and spruce, materials harvested decades ago from the very slopes that surround us. Time and weather have cured the wood to a magnificent, deep mahogany hue, almost black in the shadows, yet radiating a sense of immense warmth and resilience. The surface of these massive logs is deeply grooved, mapped with the natural winding channels of the tree's original bark and the deliberate, powerful strikes of a 19th century broadaxe. Running your gloved hand over the exterior, you would feel the rough, unyielding texture of the timber, a tactile testament to the enduring strength of the forest. The gaps between each log are meticulously sealed with a thick mortar of dried moss and clay, a traditional method of insulation that entirely blocks the biting mountain drafts. The roof, pitched at a steep angle to shed the heavy accumulations of snowfall, is covered in overlapping wooden shingles, each one carved by hand and weathered to a silvery grey patina that perfectly matches the surrounding stone. Rising from the peak of this steeply pitched roof is a modest chimney, constructed from smooth, rounded river stones gathered from the valley floor during the brief, fleeting summer months. From the top of this stone flue, a thin, wavering ribbon of pale grey smoke ascends gracefully into the star-studded sky. The column of smoke rises straight up, completely undisturbed by the wind, painting a delicate, translucent line against the backdrop of the Milky Way. As this smoke gently dissipates into the thin altitude, it carries with it the incredibly comforting rustic aroma of burning wood. It is a rich, complex scent, the sweet, sharp tang of burning pine, pitch mingling perfectly with the deep, earthy undertones of slow smouldering oak embers. This fragrance drifts across the frozen lake, reaching us long before we ever reach the door of the hut. It is a primal, welcoming smell, signaling shelter, warmth, and human presence within this vast, untamed wilderness. It invites you to relax your jaw, to let go of the last remnants of the day's fatigue, and to embrace the profound safety of this secluded haven. On the side of the wooden hut facing the lake, there is a single small window. This window is a masterpiece of winter artistry. The pane of glass, poured and rolled by hand many years ago, contains tiny, beautiful imperfections, small bubbles and waves trapped forever within the solid surface. Over the course of the long, freezing evening, the moisture from the warm interior has met the frigid exterior glass, creating a spectacular garden of ice. These frost patterns are not random. They grow in sweeping, elegant fractal designs that perfectly mimic the intricate fronds of ferns and the delicate petals of blooming flowers. They curl and weave across the pane, creating a semi-opaque curtain of frozen lace. From inside the cabin, the soft amber glow of an oil lantern shines outward, filtering through this frosted canvas. The light catches the microscopic ridges of the ice crystals, illuminating them with a warm golden radiance that contrasts profoundly with the cool blue moonlight dominating the exterior world. Looking at this glowing window feels like looking at a beautifully illuminated manuscript, a singular, brilliant point of light and warmth in the vast, sleeping dark. Leaning carefully against the sturdy exterior wall of the cabin, resting patiently beneath the protective overhang of the eaves, are the tools of the ice cutter's solitary trade. These are implements of remarkable craftsmanship, forged from heavy, durable iron and polished ash wood. There is the great ice saw, its long, flat blade resting parallel to the timber. The metal is smooth and incredibly cold, its large, jagged teeth filed to a meticulous, shining sharpness that catches the glint of the stars. The wooden handle, shaped to fit perfectly into the calloused hands of the cutter, has been rubbed smooth by countless hours of labor, the grain of the ash darkened by the natural oils of the craftsman's grip. Beside the saw stands a long, iron-tipped pike, a pole used for guiding the heavy blocks of harvested ice through the freezing water. The metal tip is wrapped tightly to the wood with thick, waxed twine, a detail of practical necessity that also speaks to the profound care and respect the cutter holds for his livelihood. These silent tools resting in the shadows are completely at peace. They harbor no loud noises, no rushed energy. They are simply waiting for the slow, methodical, rhythmic work that will commence in due time. We step closer to the heavy door of the warming hut, leaving the vast open expanse of the frozen lake behind us. The threshold beneath our boots is a solid slab of weathered grey stone, worn incredibly smooth in the center by decades of heavy leather soles crossing its surface. The door itself is a formidable barrier against the unforgiving winter, constructed from thick vertical planks of solid mountain oak. These planks are bound tightly together by heavy horizontal bands of wrought iron hammered into shape by a valley blacksmith long ago. The iron has a dull, matte black finish, completely absorbing the faint moonlight rather than reflecting it. Reach out in your mind and touch the heavy iron latch. The metal is astonishingly cold, carrying the deep, penetrating chill of the high-altitude air. Yet, as you press your thumb against the broad thumb piece, the internal mechanism yields with a deeply satisfying metallic click. The door swings inward on its massive, forged iron hinges. They do not creak or groan, they are heavily oiled and move with a deliberate, silent grace. As the door opens, a welcoming wedge of warm amber light spills out across the frozen, diamond-dusted snow. The grain of the oak door is highly pronounced, running in tight, parallel lines that tell the long, patient story of slow growth in a harsh climate. You can easily trace the undulating ridges where the softer wood has worn away over the years, leaving only the hardest, ancient fibers raised to the touch. The sensation of the timber is dry, porous, and wonderfully alive with quiet history. As we step entirely across the stone threshold and into the small hut, the atmosphere undergoes a profound, immediate transformation. The air inside is remarkably warm, possessing a heavy, comforting density that embraces you instantly from head to toe. It feels exactly as though you're wrapping a thick, downy quilt around your weary shoulders after a long journey. The sheer contrast between the brittle, freezing air of the glacier outside and this sheltered cocoon of warmth induces a slow, involuntary sigh of pure relief. Your facial muscles, previously tightened instinctively against the biting frost, immediately soften and relax. With this beautiful wave of comforting heat comes an incredibly rich, complex tapestry of scents. Inhale slowly and deeply. The foremost aroma is the deep, resinous perfume of seasoned firewood baking slowly in the hearth. Woven seamlessly into this is the subtle, earthy fragrance of dried sheep's wool from the heavy garments hanging nearby. There is also a faint, sweet ghost of pipe tobacco, a mild, roasted, burley blend that has permeated the porous log walls over many long, isolated winters. Together, these grounded aromas create a deeply hypnotic, calming atmosphere. We close the heavy oak door gently behind us. The iron latch falls back into its iron keeper with a soft, muffled thud. Instantly, the vast, echoing silence of the Alpine valley is completely severed. In its place is a beautifully intimate acoustic space, defined only by the low, murmuring sounds of domestic comfort. The remarkably thick log walls and moss insulation act as a perfect acoustic barrier, keeping you completely insulated, hidden, and removed from the sleeping wilderness outside. The glowing lifeblood of this small sanctuary is the hearth, situated securely against the far wall of the cabin. It is a masterpiece of rustic mountain masonry, built from smooth, rounded river cobbles of varying sizes, meticulously mortared together with pale, sandy clay. These dense stones have been baking in the fire's close proximity for many hours, absorbing the thermal energy until they themselves radiate a steady, constant ambient warmth deeply into the room. If you were to rest your bare hand against the highest stones of the chimney, you would feel a deeply soothing, penetrating heat that seems to seep straight past your skin and into your very bones. Inside the dark firebox, the intense roaring flames of the early evening have gently died down, leaving behind a magnificent glowing bed of dying embers. These coals form a mesmerizing miniature landscape of deep, velvety crimson and bright, pulsing orange. They do not burn with a chaotic or loud frenzy. Instead, they simply breathe, as the extremely subtle, invisible drafts of the cabin move over them. The embers softly glow brighter, then slowly fade, perfectly mimicking the slow, steady rhythm of a deep, restful slumber. Fine, powdery layer of slate-grey ash coats the outer edges of the remaining logs, looking as soft as velvet and as light as a solitary feather. The ash along the lower hearthstone is gathered in gentle, sweeping drifts, beautifully resembling the pristine snow outside, but completely warm and bone-dry to the touch. Every so often, a tiny hidden pocket of sap trapped within the dense heartwood reaches a boiling point, releasing a soft, muffled, deeply satisfying pop. Singular, brilliant orange spark detaches from the wood, floating lazily and gracefully upward toward the dark, soot-stained chimney before winking silently out of existence. The scent right near these heated stones is slightly sharper, carrying the distinct purifying essence of charcoal and scorched earth. It is a perfect visual lullaby, demanding absolutely nothing of your attention but offering endless, gentle fascination for your tired, heavy eyes. Resting quietly near the exact center of the room is a sturdy, unadorned table crafted from thick, heavy planks of Alpine pine. The wood is exceptionally pale, scrubbed meticulously clean with coarse sand and water, its flat surface bearing the faint, parallel scars of a carving knife, and the smooth, rounded depressions left by heavy earthenware mugs. Sitting perfectly in the center of this simple table is a brass kerosene lantern, serving as the sole source of illumination aside from the slow-dying fire. The heavy brass base of the lantern is beautifully tarnished, bearing a warm, mottled patina of olive, gold, and dark brown, where the original protective lacquer has long worn away from years of careful, repetitive handling. The small, knurled brass knob on the side of the burner, used meticulously to adjust the height of the burning wick, is polished to a brilliant, glowing shine by the constant friction of the cutter's calloused thumb. The glass chimney, rising elegantly from the base to protect the fire, is flawlessly transparent, allowing the small, teardrop-shaped flame to shine outward with absolute clarity. This little flame is a marvel of delicate, quiet balance. It slowly drinks the clear, slightly viscous kerosene oil through a flat, tightly woven cotton wick, burning with a steady, unwavering deep amber light. Notice how this golden illumination travels across the small room. It absolutely does not possess the harsh, blinding glare of modern artificial lighting. Instead, it moves almost like a warm liquid, pooling softly on the smooth surface of the pine table and casting long, stretching, gentle shadows across the deeply grooved texture of the surrounding log walls. As the flame flickers ever so imperceptibly, the shadows sway in a slow, continuous, hypnotic dance. The ambient light perfectly catches the subtle dust motes drifting lazily through the warm interior air, turning them into tiny floating specks of pure gold that drift and swirl in an endless, silent, slow-motion waltz. The quiet, reliable mechanics of this simple lantern provide a steady, remarkably calming focal point in the dim, tranquil room. Tucked away into the absolute warmest corner of the room, positioned perfectly between the radiant baking heat of the stone hearth and the soft golden light of the table lantern, sits a handmade armchair constructed from steam-bent hickory wood. The curved armrests are polished to a remarkable glass-like finish by the countless hours of resting friction from tired, heavy hands. Draped generously over the high wooden back and pooling softly onto the woven rush seat is a massive, incredibly thick woolen blanket. This blanket is a true triumph of traditional mountain weaving, created entirely from the undyed, rugged wool of Alpine sheep. The muted colours are deeply soothing to the eye, broad horizontal stripes of warm natural oatmeal intersecting elegantly with thick bands of rich chocolate brown and soft muted slate grey. Imagine, for a moment, running your sensitive fingertips slowly across the surface of this fabric. The texture is wonderfully heavy, slightly coarse and incredibly dense. You can easily feel the individual twisted strands of the thick yarn, spun tight and close together to permanently trap the body's warmth. Woven deeply into the very fibers of the wool is the faint, highly comforting scent of lanolin, the natural protective oil of the sheep's fleece. Looking at this empty chair, with its heavy blanket waiting patiently in the amber light, an overwhelming heavy sensation of drowsiness inevitably washes over you. It is a silent, irresistible invitation to sink deeply into the supportive, soft embrace of the heavy wool, letting the ambient heat slowly melt away every last ounce of lingering tension, held perfectly and safely in the quiet heart of the winter night. Let us shift our gentle gaze away from the radiant, pulsing warmth of the stone hearth, allowing our heavy eyes to carefully follow the soft golden light as it travels slowly across the deeply grooved timber of the cabin's interior walls. Nestled seamlessly into the deep shadowed corner entirely opposite the fire, built directly into the very architectural framework of the sturdy log cabin, stands a tall, beautifully slender provisioning cupboard. This hand-carved larder is a masterpiece of quiet, utilitarian design, constructed entirely from pale, straight-grained silver fir that has been allowed to age gracefully in the continuously dry, warm air of the mountain hut. The wood has slowly taken on a profoundly soothing, honeyed hue, glowing faintly and warmly wherever the ambient lantern light manages to touch its smooth, hand-planed surface. If you were to run your sensitive fingertips slowly down the side of this tall cupboard, you would feel an absolute absence of rough splinters. The dedicated valley carpenter who built it many winters ago spent countless unhurried hours sanding the timber with coarse, crushed pumice stone until it possessed the soft, flawlessly yielding texture of fine, antique parchment. The narrow door of the larder is secured by a remarkably simple, elegantly hand-carved wooden latch, a smooth, rounded peg of dark mountain walnut resting quietly in a gently curved notch. As you carefully and softly lift this wooden peg, there is absolutely no sharp metallic click, only the incredibly soft, deeply muffled friction of smooth wood sliding effortlessly against smooth wood. It is a profoundly organic, incredibly satisfying sound that belongs entirely to this slow-paced, handcrafted era. The hinges, forged long ago from dull, unpolished brass, yield with a slow, completely silent grace as the narrow door swings outward, revealing the meticulously organized, deeply comforting contents stored safely within the shadowed, quiet interior. Resting peacefully upon the sturdy middle shelf, wrapped with the utmost care in a pristine, unbleached linen cloth, is a massive, incredibly substantial loaf of traditional Alpine dark rye bread. This dense bread is the absolute fundamental sustenance of the deep mountain winter, baked in a large communal village stone oven down in the valley many days ago, and carried patiently up the steep, winding, snow-covered trails in a woven willow basket. As you mentally unfold the deeply creased corners of the thick linen cloth, the fabric feels wonderfully cool and deeply textured against the skin, slightly stiffened by the microscopic grains of residual flour that have become permanently embedded within its tightly woven threads. The loaf itself is a magnificent rustic creation, shaped completely by human hands. Its thick, heavily caramelized crust is a beautiful, uneven landscape of deeply roasted browns and nearly black ridges bearing the intricate overlapping crosshatch patterns of the woven proving basket in which it slowly rested and rose in the warmth of the baker's hearth. Incredibly fine, powdery dusting of pale white wheat flour settles gracefully in the deep, miniature crevices of the crust, creating a beautifully striking, soft visual contrast against the dark, deeply baked surface. If you were to bring your face close to this sleeping heavy loaf, you would be greeted instantly by an incredibly complex, profoundly grounding aroma. It is the rich, slightly sour, fermented scent of an ancient sourdough culture, mingling perfectly with the deep, earthy sweetness of roasted malted barley and the faint, incredibly subtle tang of crushed caraway seeds scattered evenly throughout the dense, heavy crumb. Beside the wrapped bread sits a remarkably small, perfectly round container, hand-carved from a single solid piece of pale birch wood, complete with a tightly fitted, smoothly overlapping lid. Inside this delicate, flawless wooden vessel rests a small, precious mound of coarse, unrefined rock salt, mined patiently from deep beneath the ancient, heavy European mountains. The individual salt crystals are surprisingly large, completely irregular and jagged in their shape, and possess a faint, beautiful, almost imperceptible tint of pale, dusky rose. In the gentle, constantly flickering glow of the table lantern's light, these rugged salt crystals glimmer and shine softly, beautifully resembling a small pile of tiny, rough-hewn gemstones hoarded safely away against the vast, encompassing white winter. Hanging delicately from exceptionally small hand-forged iron hooks driven deeply and securely into the rough underside of the top shelf are several tightly bound clusters of dried wild mountain herbs. These delicate plants were gathered painstakingly by hand during the incredibly brief, brilliantly green weeks of the fleeting Alpine summer. These dormant botanical treasures introduce an entirely new, incredibly soothing and complex layer to the gentle olfactory tapestry of the small warming hut. There is a remarkably thick bundle of wild meadow chamomile, its tiny, once vibrant yellow centers and delicate white petals now faded beautifully to a muted, soft tapestry of pale gold and dry parchment. The thin, fibrous stems are incredibly brittle to the touch, and the small leaves have curled perfectly and tightly inward, masterfully preserving the plant's delicate, soothing essential oils deep within. Directly beside the sleeping chamomile hangs a long, fragrant gathering of dark green mountain peppermint, its sharply pointed leaves completely dry and wonderfully fragile to the touch, resembling thin, weightless sheets of antique textured paper. Whenever an incredibly subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the room's warm air slowly brushes past these hanging botanical bundles, they rustle softly together with an incredibly quiet, papery whisper. It is a deeply delicate sound, so fragile and quiet that it feels almost like a gentle secret shared exclusively between the sleeping plants and the profound silence of the room. This incredibly subtle movement instantly releases a fresh, deeply calming wave of their beautifully combined fragrances into the enclosed warm space. The sweet, apple-like, profoundly gentle softness of the dried chamomile weaves effortlessly and perfectly with the bright, sharp, incredibly clean and uplifting note of the peppermint. Breathing this in instantly clears the tired mind, naturally relaxing the heavy, tight muscles of the brow and softening the line of the jaw. It is a highly fragrant, beautiful memory of the sun-drenched, humming summer meadows, perfectly preserved and suspended in the absolute frozen heart of the deep winter, offering a deeply comforting, silent promise that beneath the immense weight of the deep snow, the earth is merely sleeping, waiting patiently and peacefully for the distant, eventual return of spring. Tucked neatly away in the very lowest, darkest section of the tall cupboard, resting securely on the heavy, wide floorboards of the cabin, are the ice cutter's essential, highly durable protective garments and critical maintenance supplies. Folded meticulously into a perfectly squared, flawless stack are 2 pairs of extraordinarily thick, heavily felted wool stockings. Unlike the loosely woven blanket resting softly on the armchair, this specific wool has been aggressively boiled in hot water and heavily pressed until the individual microscopic fibers have permanently interlocked and fused together, creating an incredibly dense, virtually impenetrable fabric that is entirely windproof and profoundly insulating against the lethal cold. The heavy wool is left in its natural, undyed state, presenting a soft, cloudy shade of heather grey. It possesses an incredibly robust, heavily resilient texture that feels wonderfully substantial, thick, and deeply reassuring in the palm of the hand. Resting patiently just beside these heavy woolen stockings is a small, flat, circular tin containing a completely handmade, heavy waterproofing salve. The metallic lid of the tin is slightly dented and heavily worn smooth around the outer edges, showing the undeniable, beautiful marks of constant, necessary, repetitive use. Inside this battered, reliable tin is a thick, golden, solidified mixture of pure rendered beeswax, slowly melted mutton tallow, and deeply aromatic sticky pine rosin. When you bring this small, cold tin up to your nose, the resulting scent is absolutely profoundly intoxicating. It is a heavy, rich, waxy, and comforting sweetness derived directly from the bees, combined flawlessly and beautifully with the sharp, resinous, profoundly clean and earthy smell of the living, ancient evergreen forest. This golden protective paste is meticulously and repeatedly rubbed deeply into the heavy, stiff black leather of the cutter's spare working boots, which sit patiently and heavily in the darkest, coolest shadow of the bottom wooden shelf. The tough leather of these massive, formidable boots is incredibly thick and completely unyielding to the casual, light touch, yet it has been deeply and thoroughly conditioned over many long, hard years of labor. Because of this endless care, the material possesses a dull, remarkably soft and beautiful luster, exactly where the golden wax has been completely absorbed into the porous, ancient animal hide. The thick, heavy, deeply waxed linen laces are coiled perfectly, tightly and neatly inside the hollow shafts of the boots, completely ready for the slow, highly methodical and deliberate process of dressing for the brutally freezing environment outside. Everything contained within this quiet, beautifully organized and simple wooden cupboard speaks volumes of profound, necessary preparation. It speaks of a deep, abiding respect for the harsh, unforgiving natural elements, and of a beautifully slow, deeply deliberate lifestyle where absolutely nothing is ever rushed, and every single humble object holds an incredible life-saving and respected purpose. As you slowly and carefully close the narrow wooden door of the larder, allowing the carved latch to fall back down into its curved, smooth notch with that exact same satisfying, muffled, organic friction, you are left entirely with an overwhelming, settling sense of profound peace and utter security, knowing with absolute certainty that within this small, isolated, and incredibly warm haven all physical, worldly needs are deeply, quietly, and perfectly met. Let us gently guide our attention away from the tall, slender provisioning cupboard, allowing our heavy gaze to drift effortlessly toward the deepest, most sheltered corner of the small, square room. Here, tucked completely away from the direct, radiant heat of the glowing stone hearth, lies the ice cutter's sleeping alcove. This is not merely a piece of temporary furniture placed within the room. It is a profound architectural feature, built seamlessly and directly into the very framework of the heavy log walls. The alcove functions as a room within a room, a small, intimately enclosed sanctuary designed specifically to trap and hold the precious ambient warmth generated by a resting body. The frame of the bed is constructed from massive rectangular beams of deeply aged mountain spruce, wood that has slowly cured for decades until it possesses the iron-like density of solid stone. If you were to run your bare hand along the edge of these heavy timber rails, you would instantly feel the absolute perfection of 19th century mountain joinery. There are absolutely no iron nails or harsh metal screws holding this formidable structure together. Instead, the dedicated woodworker utilized meticulous mortise and tenon joints, securing each massive piece of timber with perfectly rounded, hand-carved hardwood pegs driven deeply and permanently into the surrounding spruce. The exposed ends of these dowels have been sanded completely flush with the surrounding frame, creating a perfectly smooth, uninterrupted surface that feels deeply satisfying and grounding to the touch. The wood here is completely unvarnished, left beautifully raw to breathe, and over the countless years of use, it has patiently absorbed a profound, dark patina from the ambient smoke of the hearth and the natural protective oils of the human hands that have touched it. It is an incredibly sturdy, unshakable foundation anchored entirely to the solid earth, offering an overwhelming sense of physical security and permanent, unwavering stability. Resting perfectly within this heavy, immovable wooden frame is the mattress, a beautifully rustic creation that speaks directly to the deeply resourceful nature of high-altitude winter living. The outer casing of the mattress, known traditionally as the ticking, is sewn completely by hand from an incredibly dense, heavy-duty, unbleached canvas fabric. This thick cotton material is woven so tightly that it is entirely impenetrable to the materials held securely within, yet it remains wonderfully breathable and remarkably soft to the touch. The interior of this canvas envelope is generously stuffed not with standard feathers, but with the finest, most fragrant dried alpine hay, harvested painstakingly by hand with a scythe during the absolute peak of the brief, radiant summer season. When you press your hand firmly against the surface of the mattress, the completely dried grass within yields with a wonderfully soft, muffled, and deeply organic rustling sound. It is a comforting acoustic texture, a gentle, papery crunch that instantly evokes vivid, sun-drenched memories of warm, rolling green meadows and clear, endless blue skies. As the heavy canvas compresses slightly under your weight, an incredibly subtle, deeply soothing aroma is gently forced out through the tightly woven fibers into the cool, still air of the cabin. It is the profoundly sweet, earthy fragrance of dried sweetgrass, mingling perfectly with the faint, lingering ghosts of wild mountain clover and dried dandelion leaves. This subtle grassy perfume transforms the simple act of lying down into a deeply immersive, highly sensory experience, completely grounding the weary mind in the peaceful, sleeping natural world. Draped meticulously over this hay-filled canvas are the primary bed linens, crafted entirely from thick, homespun flax. The fabric possesses an incredible, substantial weight and a slightly coarse, highly tactile texture that is wonderfully stimulating to the skin before quickly softening. The individual threads of the linen are wonderfully irregular, thick in some places and beautifully thin in others, a lasting, tangible testament to the rhythmic, hypnotic, and patient labor of the traditional hand loom. Although the heavy linen feels noticeably cool to the absolute first touch, it possesses a remarkable, almost magical ability to quickly capture and beautifully retain body heat, transforming into a perfectly warm, intensely cozy, and completely breathable cocoon against the freezing mountain night. Layered carefully and deliberately atop the heavy linen sheets, providing the ultimate necessary defense against the bitter, creeping cold of the Alpine midnight, is a truly magnificent, incredibly heavy winter quilt. This is not a delicate or purely decorative covering. It is a vital, formidable shield of immense warmth and profound physical comfort. The interior batting of this massive quilt consists of several incredibly thick, dense layers of raw, unspun sheep's wool, carefully washed, thoroughly carded, and meticulously layered by hand to create a thick, impenetrable barrier of trapped, highly insulating air. The sheer physical weight of this wool is utterly astonishing. If you were to slip completely beneath it, the heavy quilt would instantly press down upon you with a deeply soothing, perfectly even pressure that perfectly mimics a warm, secure, and permanent embrace. This substantial, comforting weight acts as a powerful physical anchor, instantly signaling the overworked human nervous system to completely relax, slow down, and surrender entirely to the heavy pulling gravity of deep, restorative sleep. The exterior shell of this remarkable quilt is a beautiful patchwork of repurposed, softly faded fabrics. There are large squares of deeply muted indigo blue, perfectly resembling the bruised twilight sky, stitched seamlessly together with patches of deep, earthy madder red and incredibly soft, faded forest green. The stitching holding these heavy patches perfectly together is thick, deliberate, and deeply uneven, tracking the slow, patient progress of a heavy iron needle pulled repeatedly through the dense layers by a tired but incredibly dedicated hand. Resting quietly at the very head of the alcove is a single large pillow, generously overstuffed with the softest, most delicate white goose down. Unlike the firm, highly supportive hay mattress below, this pillow is miraculously soft and completely yielding. As a heavy head sinks deeply into its center, the soft down perfectly contours to the exact shape of the neck and shoulders, providing an overwhelming feeling of absolute, weightless suspension. Tucked discreetly and carefully beneath this soft white cloud is a tiny, delicate, hand-sewn cotton sachet, filled entirely with thoroughly dry, deeply aromatic purple lavender buds. The sweet, highly floral and profoundly relaxing scent completely surrounds the pillow, creating an invisible, fragrant cloud that effortlessly lulls the racing mind into a state of absolute, unwavering tranquility. Now, while resting safely within the comforting, heavy embrace of this sturdy sleeping alcove, let us slowly turn our heavy gaze upward, toward the shadowed ceiling of the small, solitary cabin. The architecture above displays raw, uncovered structural strength. Massive, unsquared logs of ancient spruce span the entire width of the room, acting as the heavy primary crossbeams that continuously support the immense weight of the steep, snow-laden roof. These rough-hewn beams are incredibly thick, their dark, heavily textured bark still partially attached in the deepest crevices, casting long, wavering and deeply mysterious shadows in the continually flickering, soft amber light of the dying hearth fire. Between these massive structural beams, the raw underside of the heavy wooden roof shingles is completely visible. The wood above has darkened to a deeply comforting absolute charcoal grey from decades of slowly absorbing the gentle rising smoke of the indoor fire. The acoustic environment within this small enclosed space is nothing short of miraculous. Because the heavy timber walls are so incredibly thick, and the deep roof is currently buried beneath several feet of dense, packed winter snow, the cabin is entirely insulated from the harsh realities of the frozen wilderness. However, every so often an exceptionally strong, powerful gust of the high-altitude alpine wind sweeps violently down from the jagged icy peaks and rushes across the frozen surface of the vast lake. When this happens, you absolutely cannot feel the freezing draft, nor can you hear the sharp, whistling howl of the gale. Instead, the incredible external force of the wind translates only as a deeply muffled, incredibly low and completely soothing, rhythmic thrumming sound against the heavy wooden shingles far above your head. It sounds exactly like the deep, distant, rolling resonance of a great ocean wave breaking heavily and softly upon a distant sandy shore. It is a profoundly safe, deeply comforting sound, a constant, gentle reminder of the extreme, bitter cold that exists completely outside, serving only to spectacularly heighten and magnify the overwhelming, luxurious feeling of perfect warmth, absolute safety, and unbroken peace that completely fills the quiet interior of the sleeping cabin. As the deep, low vibration of the distant wind slowly fades back into absolute, ringing silence, the heavy dark timber ceiling seems to lower gently, pressing the warm, incredibly thick, sleep-inducing air down upon your resting body, wrapping you completely and finally in the timeless, perfect stillness of the high mountain midnight. Let us gently shift our lingering focus away from the heavy, deeply timbered ceiling and the profoundly comforting sleeping alcove, allowing our relaxed gaze to slowly drift back toward the ambient, radiant warmth of the stone hearth. Positioned carefully just to the left of the glowing crimson embers, standing tall and perfectly balanced upon the wide, rough-hewn floorboards of the cabin, is a beautifully intricate, purely functional, hand-carved wooden drying rack. This simple structure is crafted entirely from smooth, carefully sanded branches of river willow, stripped completely of their bark and allowed to dry until they possess a pale, bone-like finish. The joints of this folding rack are masterfully held together not by iron but by tightly wrapped, heavily waxed leather thongs tied with absolute precision to allow the frame to flex and shift without ever breaking. Draped heavily and securely over the highest horizontal rail of this sturdy willow frame is the ice cutter's immense, primary winter overcoat. This magnificent garment is a masterpiece of survival, woven from the thickest, most durable, heavily carded wool imaginable. The deep, rich color of the heavy fabric is a profound, midnight navy blue, so dark that in the dim, shadowed corners of the small room it appears almost completely black. Over the course of the incredibly long, freezing evening spent out on the open, wind-swept surface of the frozen lake, the very outermost coarse fibers of this immense coat naturally absorbed a microscopic invisible layer of crystalline frost and freezing mountain mist. Now, having been brought safely indoors and placed directly within the deep, baking heat of the sleeping fire, the heavy wool is undergoing a beautifully slow, deeply mesmerizing physical transformation. As the dense, thick fabric gradually and gently warms, the deeply trapped frozen moisture is slowly released into the dry, enclosed cabin air. It rises softly from the broad, heavy shoulders of the dark coat in incredibly thin, translucent, barely visible tendrils of pale white vapor. This delicate steam curls and drifts lazily upward, catching the golden lantern light, looking exactly like the deeply soothing smoke of sweet, burning incense ascending in a quiet, empty temple. This slow evaporation process silently releases an incredibly grounded, beautifully earthy aroma into the warm space. It is the rich, undeniable, deeply comforting scent of damp, unrefined sheep's fleece, perfectly intertwined with the faint, lingering, almost imperceptible memory of cold winter ozone and the crisp, impossibly clean essence of the high-altitude evergreen forest. The visual rhythm of this gently rising, floating steam, illuminated so softly by the continuously flickering amber light of the table lantern, is profoundly hypnotic. It demands absolutely nothing from the tired mind, inviting your already heavy eyelids to droop even further downward as you silently observe the slow, peaceful, completely silent dance of indoor warmth, gently conquering the bitter external cold. Resting patiently on the smooth, meticulously swept flat surface of the raised stone hearth, placed carefully and deliberately close enough to the slowly dying embers to absorb their deep, penetrating heat without ever risking a scorch, lies a solitary pair of heavy, remarkably thick leather work gloves. These essential tools of the ice cutter's trade are crafted entirely from tough, incredibly durable, deeply tanned ox hide. Over countless hours of continuous rhythmic labor, gripping the freezing iron handle of the great ice saw, pulling the heavy wet hemp ropes and guiding the massive floating blocks of harvested ice, the leather has completely lost any trace of its original stiff newness. Instead, the thick material has been perfectly, permanently molded into the exact, unique resting curvature of the cutter's own large, heavy hands. Even while lying completely empty on the warm hearthstone, the fingers of the gloves curl gently and softly inward, beautifully maintaining the permanent memory of a strong, relaxed grasp. The exterior surface of this heavy ox hide is deeply mapped with countless tiny, microscopic wrinkles and profoundly smooth, polished creases, resembling the beautiful, natural topography of an ancient, weathered landscape. The color is a rich, warm, deeply mottled mahogany, darkened considerably around the thick, reinforced palms where the protective beeswax and pine rosin salve has been repeatedly and heavily applied over the long, harsh winters. Inside, these formidable gloves are heavily lined with the softest, most luxurious, dense rabbit fur, providing a totally impenetrable, incredibly soft barrier of absolute warmth against the lethal chill of the exposed ice. As the radiant, gentle heat from the glowing hearth slowly bakes the heavy leather, it releases a profoundly masculine, deeply comforting and rich fragrance. It is the beautiful, distinct aroma of cured hide, warm wax, and old, deeply ingrained wood smoke, a scent that speaks powerfully of honest, patient labor and the deeply satisfying, quiet rest that inevitably follows. Hanging just above these resting gloves attached firmly to the heavy front panels of the steaming navy blue overcoat is a perfectly straight row of large, completely solid brass buttons. These heavy metallic fasteners are not highly polished, rather they bear a beautifully dull, deeply muted and heavily oxidized patina. Yet as the gentle ambient light of the room slowly washes over them, each large brass button captures a tiny isolated reflection of the pulsing orange embers. These miniature captured fires gleam softly and warmly in the surrounding shadows, creating a perfectly spaced vertical constellation of tiny glowing golden stars against the vast dark universe of the heavy woolen fabric. Directly above the wide arched opening of the glowing stone firebox, extending perfectly horizontally across the rough, heavy texture of the interior log wall, is a massive, incredibly thick wooden mantelpiece. This heavy, substantial shelf is crafted entirely from a single, solid, roughly hewn slab of ancient Alpine oak, a deeply resilient wood that has slowly cured and hardened in the dry, continuous heat of the fireside until it possesses the immovable, absolute density of solid granite. The broad, deeply grooved top surface of this oak mantle has been rubbed entirely smooth by decades of gentle, repetitive dusting, its dark, heavily pronounced grain rippling beautifully across the wood like the slow, frozen currents of a deep midnight river. Resting entirely alone near the exact center of this broad, smooth wooden shelf, completely separated from any other object, is a magnificent, deeply cherished, solid silver pocket watch. It lies perfectly flat against the dark oak, permanently tethered to a beautifully braided, heavy silver chain that coils elegantly and softly around the timepiece, like a sleeping silver serpent. The outer casing of this exquisite 19th century instrument is a triumph of delicate, microscopic artistry. It is not completely smooth, but is instead entirely covered in highly intricate, masterfully hand-engraved, swirling geometric patterns that perfectly catch and reflect the ambient, golden light of the solitary table lantern. As your heavy eyes slowly trace the path of these microscopic, sweeping silver engravings, you become profoundly aware of the watch's most defining, deeply hypnotic characteristic, its sound. In the absolute ringing silence of the small, completely insulated cabin, the pocket watch produces a highly distinct, perfectly rhythmic, and incredibly gentle ticking. It is a deeply delicate, crisp, and beautifully metallic sound, repeating with flawless, mechanical, and unyielding precision. This sound absolutely does not represent the frantic, rushed, anxiety-inducing passage of modern linear time. In this quiet, remote, and completely isolated mountain sanctuary, time does not flee, it simply pools and gathers. The slow, perfect, rhythmic beating of the tiny, jeweled gears hidden deep within the silver casing perfectly synchronizes with the slow, deep, relaxed rhythm of your own heavy breathing. It acts exactly as a soothing, completely reliable auditory pendulum, swinging gently and softly back and forth in the warm, heavy air, constantly measuring the profound, stretching peace of the winter night. Listening to this tiny mechanical heartbeat effortlessly and beautifully aligns your deeply tired mind with the slow, completely unhurried and majestic pace of the natural world outside, drawing you further and further down into a state of total, heavy and unbroken relaxation. Let us slowly guide our tranquil attention away from the hypnotic, rhythmic ticking of the silver pocket watch resting upon the oak mantel, and look downward, returning our gaze to the deep, radiating warmth of the stone hearth. Positioned carefully on the very edge of the glowing embers, sitting completely level upon a heavy, three-legged trivet forged from blackened cast iron, rests a beautifully weathered antique copper kettle. This heavy vessel is a vital, daily companion in the solitary life of the ice cutter. The exterior of the kettle is a breathtaking tapestry of rich, metallic history. It has completely lost the bright, mirror-like shine of its youth, having been permanently transformed by years of constant exposure to open flames and swirling wood smoke. The thick copper now boasts a deeply soothing, muted patina, a beautifully complex landscape of deep roasted chestnut, oxidized streaks of pale sea green, and dark charcoal smudges where the soot has been gently, repeatedly wiped away by a heavy cloth. The sturdy handle, arched perfectly over the top, is tightly and meticulously wrapped in thick, coarse hemp rope, providing a secure, heat-proof grip for the heavy, calloused hands of the worker. Inside this heavy copper chamber, resting quietly in the dark, is pure, untouched glacial meltwater, drawn by hand earlier in the evening from a small, completely unfrozen spring bubbling beneath the deep snowdrifts. As the intense penetrating heat from the dying hearth fire slowly transfers through the thick metal base of the kettle, a deeply calming auditory transformation begins to unfold within the quiet cabin. It starts as an incredibly low, almost imperceptible vibration, a deeply muffled, continuous hum that you feel in the stillness of the air just as much as you hear it. Slowly, beautifully, this low hum transitions into the highly delicate, rhythmic sound of a gentle simmer. Tiny, microscopic pearls of air begin to form at the very bottom of the copper, detaching one by one and floating upward to break the surface with a perfectly soft, delicate plink. It is a profoundly domestic, deeply reassuring sound, an auditory promise of forthcoming warmth and internal comfort, perfectly counterbalancing the vast frozen silence of the sleeping mountain valley outside, while the pure glacial water slowly and patiently approaches a rolling boil. Let us observe a deeply rooted, forgotten sensory tradition of the 19th century Alpine winter. Resting upon the smooth, scrubbed pine table directly beside the continuously glowing amber light of the brass lantern is a small, beautifully crafted square hand grinder. The body of this little machine is constructed entirely from solid, deeply polished cherry wood, possessing a rich, warm, reddish-brown hue that seems to glow from within under the soft illumination. The corners of the wooden box are joined with tiny, flawless, hand-cut dovetails, a lasting testament to the meticulous care of a valley carpenter. Extending from the top of this cherry wood box is a beautifully curved heavy iron crank, topped with a smooth, perfectly rounded knob of dark walnut. In this remote, completely isolated high-altitude world of 1895, imported coffee beans are an unimaginably rare and expensive luxury, far beyond the reach of a humble ice cutter. Instead, he relies deeply upon a traditional, beautifully resourceful and profoundly earthy alternative, a heavy roasted blend of dried wild chicory root, deeply toasted barley grains, and the thick, fibrous taproots of the mountain dandelion. These incredibly humble ingredients were gathered painstakingly by hand during the long golden afternoons of the late summer, scrubbed entirely clean of the rich, dark soil, and roasted slowly on flat iron sheets over a low, smouldering fire until they became entirely dry, hard, and perfectly brittle. Now, as a small handful of these dark, irregular, pebble-like roots is gently poured into the heavy iron hopper of the wooden grinder, they make a highly satisfying, completely dry, and wonderful clattering sound against the metal. Imagine, for a moment, the slow, highly deliberate, and deeply rhythmic motion of turning that heavy iron crank. As the wooden knob is continuously and patiently rotated, the heavy internal iron burrs engage, catching and crushing the hard-roasted roots perfectly between their unyielding sharp metal teeth. The acoustic texture of this simple action is nothing short of hypnotic. It produces a deeply resonant, incredibly satisfying, low-pitched crunching sound, a slow, highly mechanical grinding that echoes softly and perfectly throughout the insulated space of the quiet cabin. With every single slow rotation of the crank handle, a completely new, profoundly rich, and intensely grounding aroma is suddenly and beautifully released into the warm, heavy air of the room. This fragrance is utterly magnificent. It entirely lacks the sharp, acidic bite of standard coffee, offering instead an incredibly deep, heavy, and beautifully mellow olfactory profile. It smells profoundly of the deep, sleeping earth itself, a rich, dark, heavily roasted and intensely nutty perfume carrying beautifully subtle, hidden undertones of dark cocoa, toasted wood, and the faint, sweet memory of late summer soil baking slowly under the mountain sun. This deeply earthy fragrance gently rises and instantly entwines with the lingering scents of the sweet pipe tobacco, the slowly drying sheep's wool, and the resinous wood smoke of the hearth, creating an incredibly thick, invisible sensory blanket that entirely wraps around your resting mind, grounding you perfectly and absolutely in this precise, peaceful, completely unhurried moment in time. As the grinding slowly concludes, leaving only a perfectly fine, deeply dark powder resting safely in the small, slide-out wooden drawer at the base of the mill, the copper kettle on the hearth begins to softly announce its readiness. Thin, perfectly continuous, an incredibly delicate ribbon of white steam begins to curl and drift lazily from the curved, graceful spout of the kettle, whistling with a pitch so exceptionally low and gentle that it resembles a long, slow sigh of relief. The water is now poured meticulously and slowly into a beautifully small, chipped, enameled tin pot containing the freshly ground dark roots. The immediate collision of the boiling water and the heavily roasted powder produces a wonderful, sharp, and deeply satisfying hiss. Instantly, a thick, incredibly dark and heavy bloom gently rises to the very surface of the water, bubbling softly as the rich, earthy oils and deeply embedded flavors are perfectly and completely extracted. The liquid is then carefully and slowly strained through a small, incredibly fine sieve woven tightly from horsehair, falling gracefully into the waiting vessel below. This vessel is an exquisitely heavy, magnificently thick-walled stoneware mug, thrown entirely by hand on a slow, rhythmic potter's wheel in a distant sleeping village. The mug is coated in a wonderfully uneven, heavy ceramic glaze, a deeply soothing, mottled shade of dark moss green that fades perfectly into a raw, unglazed, rough-textured grey clay at its sturdy, wide base. As the nearly boiling dark liquid fills this heavy mug, the thick clay walls immediately begin to absorb the profound heat, transforming the vessel into a perfect, deeply comforting hand warmer. Finally, an incredibly delicate, totally beautiful finishing touch is slowly added to this rustic, warming midnight elixir. Resting quietly beside the brass lantern is a tiny, perfectly round jar of exceptionally thick, heavily crystallized mountain honey. This is not the thin, highly processed golden syrup of the modern world. It is a raw, opaque, pale yellow treasure gathered tirelessly by high-altitude bees from the incredibly brief, brilliant blooming of Alpine wildflowers. A small, slightly tarnished silver spoon is gently dipped into the heavy jar, extracting a perfectly solid, thick mound of this fragrant, sugary gold. As the honey is slowly and gently submerged into the steaming, dark, chicory brew, it immediately begins to soften, heavily melting from the edges inward, slowly releasing its incredibly complex, deeply floral and intensely sweet perfume into the rising steam. The silver spoon is then stirred softly and rhythmically through the dark liquid in a continuously slow, perfect circle. The soft, incredibly delicate, metallic clinking of the spoon repeatedly and gently striking the heavy interior walls of the thick clay mug rings out clearly in the completely silent room. It is a slow, deeply hypnotic and completely soothing chime, clink, 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 a beautiful domestic lullaby that perfectly signals the absolute end of labor and the deeply anticipated, thoroughly deserved arrival of perfect, uninterrupted rest. You can easily imagine wrapping both of your tired, heavy hands entirely around the deep, radiating warmth of that heavy clay mug, bringing the steaming, fragrant rim slowly to your lips, and allowing the profound, grounding peace of this forgotten, simple mountain tradition to wash completely and entirely over your resting spirit. Let us allow the comforting, deeply restorative warmth of the roasted chicory and gently melted mountain honey to settle completely within, and turn our slow, tranquil attention to the quiet, highly deliberate rituals of preparation that peacefully bridge the absolute end of one grueling day with the inevitable distant beginning of the next. Resting silently upon the deeply grooved surface of the pale pine table situated just at the absolute fading edge of the golden pool of lantern light, lies a tightly rolled, incredibly heavy bundle of deeply aged, remarkably thick cowhide. This substantial leather parcel is the ice cutter's essential tool roll, a deeply personal, meticulously maintained sanctuary for the smaller, highly vital implements of his frozen trade. The exterior of this heavy rolled leather is beautifully dark, completely smooth and heavily polished from countless decades of constant, necessary transport. It is secured tightly by two long, incredibly soft and supple leather straps, fastened meticulously with small, dull, heavily oxidized brass buckles. As the heavy, calloused hands of the cutter carefully and slowly unbuckle these ancient straps, pulling the soft, dark leather completely free from the brass teeth, there is an incredibly soft, deeply satisfying, muffled sound of heavy material yielding to intentional, gentle movement. The bundle is slowly unfurled across the flat surface of the pine table, the heavy hide rolling open with a low, profoundly organic, and beautifully soft thwap against the pale wood. The interior of this heavy roll completely reveals an entirely different tactile universe. It is lined entirely with incredibly soft, completely undyed suede, possessing a remarkably fine, velvety texture that perfectly and continuously cushions the heavy iron tools nestled safely within their individual, custom-stitched pockets. The deeply intoxicating, profoundly grounded aroma of this open tool roll instantly joins the complex sensory atmosphere of the small cabin. It is the incredibly rich, heavy scent of raw, tanned hide, beautifully and perfectly mingled with the sharp, deeply clean metallic tang of forged iron and the sweet, lingering perfume of organic, protective, lubricating oils. Resting securely within the widest, deepest pocket of the soft suede lining is a heavy, beautifully forged iron ice chisel, known traditionally in the high valleys as a spud. This formidable tool is an absolute masterpiece of utilitarian 19th century blacksmithing, utilized meticulously and repeatedly to score the deep, perfect, guiding lines into the thick lake ice before the massive, heavy saws are ever deployed. The long, heavy shaft of the chisel is forged from solid, deeply blackened iron, bearing the incredibly subtle, beautiful, and overlapping hammer marks of the village smith who shaped it directly from the glowing white-hot coals many decades ago. These microscopic indentations perfectly catch the continuously flickering amber light of the lantern, creating a beautifully mottled, shimmering visual effect across the dark, completely unyielding metal. The broad, flat blade at the very tip of the heavy chisel, however, is a completely different story. It is a stunning, breathtaking crescent of pure, highly polished, incredibly bright, high-carbon steel to completely maintain the razor-like, flawless perfection of this crucial cutting edge. A deeply hypnotic, beautifully slow, and completely mandatory ritual of maintenance must be strictly observed before sleep can be entirely embraced. From a highly specialized, tiny leather pouch stitched deeply into the very corner of the tool roll, the cutter carefully and silently extracts a beautifully rectangular, naturally mined whetstone. This sharpening stone is a silent marvel of the natural world, quarried painstakingly from deep within a distant ancient mountain range. It possesses two completely distinct, highly functional sides. The bottom surface is slightly coarse, boasting a deeply porous, dark slate-grey texture perfectly used for removing microscopic nicks in the heavy steel. The top surface, however, is incredibly smooth, possessing a perfectly flat, beautifully pale, chalky white finish designed specifically for honing the metal to an impossibly sharp, flawless, and terrifyingly precise edge. Placed gently and quietly beside this natural stone on the pale pine table is a remarkably small, beautifully delicate glass vial, stoppered perfectly and securely with a tiny, hand-carved piece of natural cork. Inside this fragile, completely clear glass chamber rests a small, highly precious quantity of pure, cold-pressed linseed oil. The heavy oil is a visually stunning, incredibly thick liquid, boasting a profoundly rich, vibrant shade of deep, glowing golden amber that perfectly and magically mimics the exact color of the continuously flickering lantern flame resting nearby. The cutter slowly and deliberately removes the tiny cork stopper, a remarkably soft action that instantly releases a beautiful, deeply earthy and wonderfully nutty aroma into the small enclosed space. A scent that vividly and beautifully recalls endless, quietly waving fields of pale blue flax flowers blooming silently beneath the intense forgotten summer sun, with absolute unhurried and perfectly practiced precision. The cutter gently tilts the delicate glass vial, allowing exactly 3 perfectly round, highly viscous, glowing drops of the heavy oil to fall gracefully and silently onto the smooth, pale surface of the sharpening stone. The heavy oil pools beautifully for a fraction of a second before slowly, microscopically seeping directly into the deep, completely invisible pores of the ancient rock, instantly transforming the chalky white surface into a deeply saturated, beautifully dark, and perfectly lubricated slate. Now begins the profoundly mesmerizing, completely auditory magic of the ancient sharpening ritual. The heavy iron chisel is grasped firmly, but completely without tension. The incredibly bright steel edge is placed precisely against the deeply oiled stone at a perfect, mathematically exact angle, born purely of deeply ingrained muscle memory and countless silent years of repetitive practice. With a slow, entirely fluid, and wonderfully deliberate motion, the heavy steel is pushed smoothly across the entire length of the lubricated stone. This continuous, incredibly heavy friction produces a highly distinct, deeply hypnotic, and completely soothing sound. It is a long, slow, perfectly rhythmic shh, shh. It is the highly textured, beautiful auditory song of hard steel yielding gracefully and continuously to harder stone. The sound is absolutely neither harsh nor grating, because of the thick, beautifully dampening presence of the heavy linseed oil. The acoustic profile is wonderfully muffled, profoundly smooth, and deeply resonant. It beautifully and perfectly echoes the slow, rhythmic, pulling sound of the distant, high-altitude wind slipping gently over the heavy wooden shingles of the snow-covered roof. With every single incredibly patient stroke, a microscopically thin, completely invisible layer of heavy metal is gently and perfectly removed. The ambient amber light from the brass lantern dances beautifully and hypnotically across the incredibly thin wet film of golden oil, continuously gathering along the bright edge of the moving steel. As the slow, heavy strokes continue repeating perfectly and rhythmically in the deeply quiet room, A tiny, almost completely invisible slurry begins to slowly form upon the dark surface of the whetstone, a beautiful dark metallic paste created entirely by the perfect, continuous mixture of the organic oil and the microscopic suspended particles of pure shaved iron. This incredibly slow, deeply repetitive motion acts as a profound, thoroughly physical meditation. It demands absolutely complete, unyielding physical focus, yet it paradoxically allows the heavy, deeply tired mind to wander completely freely and entirely detach from the immense, crushing physical burdens of the long, freezing day. After several long, incredibly peaceful minutes of this beautiful rhythmic friction, the cutter gently lifts the heavy chisel entirely from the stone. He reaches deeply into the heavy leather tool roll and gently retrieves a completely clean, wonderfully soft and beautifully frayed square of white cotton cloth. With a slow, deeply satisfying and completely thorough sweeping motion, he firmly wipes the dark, oily slurry entirely away from the heavy steel blade. As the remarkably soft cotton passes completely over the metal, leaving it flawlessly clean and perfectly dry, the true, incredible result of this patient, silent labor is beautifully and absolutely revealed. The very edge of the heavy iron chisel now completely lacks any shadow or dullness. It is an impossibly thin, blindingly bright, and perfectly unbroken line of pure glowing silver. It catches the ambient light of the room with absolute stunning clarity, shining brightly and beautifully against the deep, dark, comforting shadows of the background. It is a stunning, profound visual testament to the absolute beauty of slow, necessary, and completely deliberate maintenance. The newly sharpened, pristine tool is then gently, carefully, and slowly slid back perfectly into its soft suede pocket within the heavy leather roll. The small, delicate glass vial of golden oil is securely recorked, the dark whetstone is wiped perfectly clean, and the heavy leather straps are slowly, meticulously buckled once more. This deeply quiet, completely forgotten tradition of nightly restoration is now perfectly and beautifully complete, leaving behind an overwhelming, deeply comforting sense of total readiness, absolute unwavering order and profound internal peace, effortlessly and seamlessly preparing the heavy, resting mind to finally surrender entirely to the approaching deep embrace of absolute unbroken sleep. Let us gently and peacefully shift our quiet observation away from the heavily oiled, perfectly maintained steel of the ice cutter's tools, allowing our calm attention to drift gracefully toward the very edge of the deeply scrubbed pine table. Hidden seamlessly directly beneath the thick, overhanging edge of this heavy wooden surface is a surprisingly delicate, masterfully concealed little drawer. It is crafted entirely from the same pale, ancient pine as the table itself, completely lacking any metal handle or obvious pull. Instead, there is only a smooth, beautifully carved, shallow crescent depression on the underside, designed perfectly to accommodate the soft, upward press of resting fingertips. As the cutter reaches beneath and slowly, patiently pulls this hidden compartment outward, the ungreased, raw wooden tracks slide against one another with an incredibly soft, deeply resonant, and entirely organic friction. It is a profoundly hushed, whispering sound of wood gliding over wood, pulling completely free with a gentle, satisfying weight. Resting safely within the shallow, shadowed confines of this tiny wooden drawer lies a remarkably well-preserved, intimately scaled, leather-bound ledger. This heavy little book is the sole, silent witness to the staggering, monumental physical labor performed continuously out on the frozen, wind-swept expanse of the Alpine lake. It is the archive of the frost, completely dedicated to documenting the exact, meticulous measurements and total immense tonnage of the perfectly clear deep winter ice harvested for the distant valleys below. The exterior cover of this small rectangular volume is bound tightly in heavily aged, incredibly supple calfskin. The leather is a breathtakingly rich, mottled shade of deep, dark cordovan, a profoundly warm reddish-brown hue that flawlessly mimics the deep, resting color of fallen autumn oak leaves. The outer edges of this thick leather cover are completely burnished and wonderfully rounded, permanently softened by the countless repetitive, gentle touches of heavy, tired hands, opening and closing its pages at the absolute quiet end of every single freezing day. Slowly, with the utmost unhurried reverence, the heavy calfskin cover is gently lifted and opened flat against the warm, completely illuminated surface of the pine table. The very first thing to greet the senses is a highly distinct, deeply comforting, and beautifully antique aroma. It is the profoundly dry, wonderfully sweet, and beautifully musty scent of heavily aged 19th century paper, mingled perfectly with the faint, lingering, earthy ghost of traditional animal hide binding glue and the incredibly subtle, incredibly dry dust of long-forgotten dormant years. The interior pages of this heavy ledger are absolutely not the thin, fragile, heavily bleached paper of the modern rushed world. They are crafted entirely from immensely thick, heavily textured, pure cotton rag. If you were to softly drag the highly sensitive tips of your fingers across the perfectly blank surface of one of these pages, you would instantly feel a deeply satisfying, incredibly uneven and beautifully pronounced tactile landscape. The paper is wonderfully porous and heavily fibrous, possessing a profoundly soft, fabric-like quality that feels exceptionally warm and incredibly substantial to the touch. The outer edges of these thick, heavy pages are left beautifully deckled, completely untrimmed, wonderfully irregular and softly feathered, a beautiful, lasting testament to the slow, highly manual and deeply rhythmic process of traditional wooden frame papermaking. As the cutter gently and slowly turns a single heavy page to locate the first completely blank, waiting spread, the thick cotton material bends and falls with a profoundly distinct, beautifully muffled and incredibly soft papery rustle. It is a deeply delicate, sweeping sound, incredibly quiet yet entirely crisp, perfectly cutting through the absolute ringing silence of the insulated log cabin. It is the beautiful auditory signature of history being slowly, patiently, and continuously written, one quiet, freezing midnight at a time. Resting patiently directly beside this open waiting ledger, permanently occupying a small, beautifully carved, circular depression near the absolute corner of the pine table, sits a remarkably heavy, deeply faceted glass inkwell. The thick, transparent glass is completely flawless, poured and shaped perfectly to firmly anchor the precious dark liquid held securely within, completely preventing any accidental spills in the dim, flickering lantern light. Capping this heavy, solid glass fortress is a small, perfectly fitted, deeply stained cork stopper, topped elegantly with a thin, beautifully oxidized disc of dark brass. The cutter reaches out and gently, slowly twists this small brass cap, pulling the tight cork perfectly free from the smooth glass neck, with a tiny, incredibly soft, and deeply satisfying pop. The immediate removal of this tight seal instantly releases the highly distinct, profoundly sharp, and deeply historic aroma of traditional iron gall ink. It is an incredibly rich, complex, and beautiful fragrance, a deeply earthy, heavily astringent scent created entirely by the slow, natural fermentation of crushed oak apples, completely mixed perfectly with the sharp, clean, metallic tang of raw iron sulfate, peering slowly and directly into the heavy glass well. The ink appears to be an absolute, fathomless void. It is a profoundly dark, incredibly rich, and completely opaque shade of deep oceanic indigo, so intensely dark that it appears entirely black in the soft, ambient, amber shadows of the small room, catching tiny, isolated, beautiful pinpricks of golden light exclusively on its perfectly still dark surface. With an incredibly slow, perfectly practiced grace, the cutter lifts a long, beautifully slender, hand-carved wooden dip pen from a resting groove completely adjacent to the heavy inkwell. The long handle of this writing instrument is carved from incredibly lightweight, pale Alpine birch, heavily polished until it is flawlessly smooth, entirely lacking any heavy metallic mechanisms or internal hidden reservoirs. At the very tip of this pale wooden shaft, held perfectly and securely by a small, completely unpolished, beautifully dull brass ferrule, is a highly delicate, perfectly split, brilliantly shining steel nib. The cutter gently, slowly, and precisely lowers the absolute tip of this brilliant steel nib directly into the dark resting pool of the iron gall ink. The heavy, dark liquid instantly and perfectly clings to the bright, cold metal, drawn beautifully and effortlessly upward into the microscopic, perfectly carved central split of the nib, entirely through the silent, invisible, and miraculous physical pull of natural capillary action. When the delicate pen is slowly lifted completely free from the glass well, a single, perfectly formed, incredibly heavy, dark droplet clings momentarily to the absolute tip before falling silently, heavily and perfectly back into the deep pool, leaving the shining steel nib perfectly and beautifully charged with exactly enough wet ink to complete a single, highly deliberate and perfectly written line. The heavy, calloused hand slowly brings the loaded, wet steel nib down to perfectly meet the waiting, heavily textured, soft cotton rag paper. The instant the sharp metal softly touches the thick page, the true, deeply hypnotic and profoundly rhythmic magic of the act completely begins. As the cutter slowly, meticulously shapes the highly elegant, beautifully sweeping cursive letters of the traditional 19th century script, documenting the precise thickness and total volume of the day's harvest, the steel nib perfectly scratches across the porous, uneven paper. This highly specific action produces an incredibly delicate, beautifully crisp, and entirely rhythmic acoustic texture. It is a profoundly quiet, highly textured, completely continuous scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound is completely devoid of any harshness. Rather, it is a deeply soothing, perfectly metered, papery whisper that beautifully and flawlessly perfectly matches the slow, deep, perfectly relaxed cadence of a resting heartbeat. The heavy, dark ink flows smoothly, flawlessly, and beautifully from the split steel, leaving behind a perfectly permanent, deeply saturated, and continuously wet, shining trail that slowly, magically absorbs directly into the deep, welcoming fibers of the thick cotton page. Every few moments, the rhythmic, soothing scratching completely stops, beautifully replaced by the highly delicate, incredibly soft metallic clink of the steel nib, returning perfectly to the heavy glass inkwell to gracefully and silently draw more ink. This slow, utterly perfect, and totally unhurried cycle, dip, tap, scratch, pause, creates a beautiful, deeply comforting, and highly repetitive lullaby of necessary historical documentation. To perfectly and permanently preserve this wet, highly saturated, heavily shining ink without causing a single microscopic smudge, the cutter finally reaches for a wonderfully small, beautifully curved, hand-carved wooden rocker blotter resting silently near the heavy brass lantern. The beautifully curved bottom of this small wooden tool is covered entirely and tightly with a heavy, deeply absorbent pale pink blotting paper. With an incredibly slow, perfectly gentle, and beautifully rocking motion, the cutter precisely presses the curved soft paper directly over the freshly written wet lines of the ledger. The thick, porous pink paper instantly, beautifully, and flawlessly absorbs any remaining excess moisture directly from the surface of the thick cotton page, leaving the beautifully formed, perfectly elegant, dark cursive letters utterly dry, completely flat, and entirely permanent. The heavy, dark calfskin cover of the ledger is then slowly, gracefully, and completely closed, falling shut with a heavy, deeply satisfying, and remarkably soft thud that securely completely seals the exhaustive labor of the long freezing day into the permanent, unmoving depths of quiet history. The hidden, completely ungreased wooden drawer is slowly, seamlessly pushed back into perfectly, completely flush alignment directly beneath the heavy pine table, gently sliding into absolute darkness with that exact same, profoundly comforting, whispering friction of smooth wood upon smooth wood. The absolute finality of this quiet, deeply administrative task releases an overwhelming, completely heavy and profoundly warm wave of absolute closure over the weary mind, beautifully signaling that all worldly physical responsibilities have been perfectly, completely fulfilled, and that nothing, absolutely nothing remains to be done but to sink deeply, heavily, and peacefully into the long, dark, entirely undisturbed sanctuary of total rest. Let us softly transition our deeply relaxed focus away from the entirely closed heavy leather ledger and the completely silent dark glass inkwell resting patiently upon the pale pine table. With the absolute entirety of the day's meticulous administrative duties flawlessly and permanently completed, the ice cutter slowly, deliberately rises. He moves with a heavy, quiet, and profoundly unhurried grace back toward the deeply inviting, warmest corner of the small room. He sinks gracefully and completely into the deep, supportive, and unyielding embrace of the steam-bent hickory armchair, pulling the heavy, incredibly thick, naturally woven sheep's wool blanket perfectly over his tired, aching legs. The radiant, penetrating, and entirely soothing heat from the glowing, slowly dying hearth fire instantly washes completely over him in a magnificent, invisible wave of pure, heavy comfort. From the deep, shadowed depths of his thick, navy blue woolen vest pocket, he gently and silently extracts a beautifully small, wonderfully soft, and incredibly supple pouch. This modest pouch is crafted entirely from genuine, deeply conditioned chamois leather, possessing a beautifully muted, incredibly soft, pale mustard yellow hue that perfectly captures and reflects the gentle, flickering amber light of the nearby table lantern. The extreme, unparalleled softness of this leather is truly a tactile marvel. It yields perfectly and effortlessly to the incredibly slight, gentle pressure of his heavy fingertips, feeling entirely like a piece of thick, luxurious, heavy velvet rather than cured animal hide. Wrapped beautifully and securely around the entire circumference of this incredibly soft leather pouch is a long, highly pliable, beautifully thin leather thong tied flawlessly and meticulously in a deeply traditional, easily released slip knot. With an incredibly slow, perfectly practiced, and deeply relaxing motion, the heavily calloused fingers gently pull the loose, dangling end of the thin leather thong. The simple knot yields beautifully and completely silently, allowing the incredibly soft chamois leather to perfectly and gracefully unfold directly into the broad, warm, and highly relaxed palm of the cutter's heavy hand. The immediate gentle opening of this small, perfectly sealed pouch instantly releases a breathtakingly rich, incredibly deep, and profoundly complex sensory experience entirely into the quiet, heavily insulated air of the small log cabin. It is the exquisite, deeply intoxicating, and incredibly heavy aroma of traditionally cured 19th century Alpine pipe tobacco. This is absolutely not a harsh, sharp, or overwhelmingly pungent scent. Rather, it is a beautifully sweet, profoundly dark, and heavily earthy perfume that instantly and effortlessly grounds the tired, wandering mind. The fragrance is a perfectly balanced, deeply harmonious blend of heavily roasted dark Virginia leaf, slowly air-cured burley, and a tiny, highly precious, intensely fragrant pinch of black Cavendish that has been meticulously fermented under immense, heavy physical pressure. If you were to bring your face softly and gently toward this open, resting leather pouch, you would immediately detect the beautiful, heavy, lingering undertones of dark, thoroughly dried mountain plums, completely mingled with the deep, sweet essence of pure vanilla bean, the raw, deeply earthy richness of damp, autumn forest soil, and the beautifully faint, incredibly subtle memory of old, deeply charred oak barrels. The tobacco itself is cut flawlessly and meticulously into perfectly thin, beautifully even, and incredibly long ribbons. The colors of these delicate strands range magnificently from the lightest, pale golden yellow to a deeply rich, profoundly dark, almost completely black mahogany. As the heavy fingers gently and slowly pinch a small, perfect amount of this fragrant leaf, the texture is wonderfully surprising. It is entirely devoid of any dry, crumbling brittleness. Instead, it is incredibly soft, beautifully pliable, and possesses a profoundly perfect, remarkably subtle level of moisture, feeling exactly like the gentle, forgiving texture of freshly fallen, deeply shadowed moss resting peacefully upon an ancient, sleeping forest stone. Resting securely and entirely undisturbed at the absolute bottom of this beautiful soft chamois pouch is the cutter's deeply cherished, heavily utilized, and profoundly personal smoking pipe. It is an exquisite, masterfully carved, beautifully heavy instrument, crafted entirely by hand from a single solid, flawless block of ancient Mediterranean briarwood. The cutter slowly, gently, and reverently lifts the heavy pipe completely free from the fragrant ribbons of tobacco, allowing its beautifully smooth, highly polished wooden bowl to rest perfectly and naturally within the deep, secure curve of his warm, relaxed palm. The exterior surface of this heavy briarwood is a breathtaking, completely captivating, and profoundly beautiful visual masterpiece of natural, deep-grained architecture. Over countless years of highly deliberate, slow and completely rhythmic use, the heavy natural oils from the cutter's bare hands have flawlessly burnished the hardwood to an incredibly deep, rich and remarkably dark walnut finish, completely transforming the porous surface into a perfectly smooth, beautifully glowing glass-like texture. If you were to gaze deeply and slowly into the perfectly polished wood under the soft, continuously flickering amber light of the room, you would easily see the highly intricate, incredibly dense and perfectly swirling patterns of the raw briar grain. There are beautifully tiny, highly concentrated clusters of microscopic perfect circles known traditionally as bird's eye grain, gracefully intersecting completely with long sweeping, perfectly parallel lines of dark, heavily defined flame grain that perfectly mimic the slow upward drift of warm hearth smoke. Separating this heavy, deeply carved wooden bowl from the mouthpiece is a beautifully thin, impeccably polished, completely flawless ring of solid sterling silver. The stem itself is carved flawlessly and perfectly from a single, solid, beautiful piece of natural animal horn. The smooth horn possesses a profoundly magnificent, deeply translucent, softly glowing golden yellow hue, bearing incredibly subtle, beautifully dark, and wonderfully wispy internal striations that perfectly and gently resemble the slowly shifting heavy clouds of a deeply fading silent twilight sky. The incredibly slow, deeply deliberate, and entirely unhurried process of perfectly packing the heavy briar bowl is a profound, beautifully quiet, and intensely rhythmic tactile meditation. The cutter gently, meticulously takes the very first, incredibly small, entirely loose pinch of the heavily fragrant, dark ribbon tobacco and drops it gracefully and silently down into the absolute dark bottom of the deep wooden chamber. With the incredibly soft, perfectly gentle and beautifully measured pressure of his heavy index finger, he completely lightly presses the soft, fragrant leaf downward. This initial, beautifully gentle compression ensures a flawless, unbroken and perfectly smooth flow of warm air completely through the very bottom of the heavy pipe. He then slowly, meticulously and perfectly gathers a second, slightly larger and noticeably heavier pinch of the wonderfully pliable, fragrant tobacco ribbons, dropping them beautifully and softly directly upon the first foundational layer. This time the heavy finger applies a slightly firmer, completely deeper, and beautifully measured pressure, perfectly compacting the dark leaf until it beautifully and completely fills the heavy wooden bowl to the exact, precise halfway mark. This second, incredibly deliberate press perfectly creates a wonderfully dense, deeply supportive foundation for the final, crowning layer of leaf. Finally, a third, beautifully generous pinch is perfectly and meticulously gathered, overflowing gently and softly slightly above the perfectly smooth, deeply polished wooden rim of the heavy briar bowl, with a remarkably firm, incredibly strong and beautifully heavy downward press of his heavily calloused thumb. The cutter perfectly, flawlessly and completely packs the remaining tobacco directly and firmly into the chamber. This final, deeply satisfying compression leaves the top surface of the beautifully packed tobacco completely flat, incredibly dense, and perfectly flawlessly even, resting exactly one microscopic fraction of an inch directly below the very top edge of the deeply polished, glowing wooden bowl. The absolute perfection of this highly tactile, entirely repetitive, and deeply traditional packing ritual brings a profound, incredibly heavy and beautifully complete sense of total preparedness and deeply calming order to the quiet, completely isolated mountain room. To beautifully and perfectly ignite this meticulously prepared, heavily fragrant bowl, the cutter absolutely shuns the harsh, sharp, visually disruptive and entirely modern flair of a chemical match. Instead, he reaches slowly, perfectly, and with incredible graceful precision toward a small, beautifully hand-woven willow basket resting patiently on the raised stone hearth. From this quiet basket, he gently extracts a single, perfectly straight, incredibly thin, and beautifully long wooden spill, split flawlessly and meticulously from a wonderfully fragrant block of totally dried Alpine cedar. With a highly deliberate, remarkably slow and entirely fluid motion, he gently leans forward in his deep, comfortable hickory chair, slowly extending the very tip of this thin, delicate cedar spill directly into the profound, glowing, heavy red heart of the dying hearth embers. The incredibly dry, perfectly aged wood instantly, beautifully, and entirely silently catches the deep heat, blooming perfectly and gracefully into a small, incredibly soft, beautifully teardrop-shaped, completely golden flame. He slowly, gently withdraws the perfectly burning cedar spill, bringing the small, completely steady and beautifully quiet flame perfectly and directly over the deeply packed dark bowl of the heavy briar pipe. As he slowly, rhythmically, and perfectly draws the warm air directly through the smooth, cool horn stem, the small golden flame is beautifully and magnetically pulled downward, perfectly kissing the very top surface of the dense, fragrant tobacco. The deeply dark ribbons instantly, beautifully and gracefully expand, glowing perfectly with an incredibly bright, beautifully vibrant, completely cherry-red heat that flawlessly mirrors the deep resting embers in the heavy stone hearth. As the deeply calming, rhythmic, and incredibly slow puffing gently continues, beautifully thick, completely luxurious, and incredibly dense plumes of heavily fragrant pale blue smoke begin to gracefully and silently rise perfectly from the heavy wooden bowl. The smoke does absolutely not rush or billow. Instead, it slowly, beautifully, and perfectly drifts upward in incredibly lazy, perfectly swirling, profoundly hypnotic, and completely silent spirals. These delicate, wonderfully heavy ribbons of pale blue smoke perfectly catch the gentle, continuously flickering amber light of the table lantern, twirling and dancing completely effortlessly before finally, beautifully, and gently dissipating directly into the deep, heavy, dark shadows of the immensely thick, heavily timbered spruce ceiling. The deeply intoxicating, profoundly calming, heavily roasted aroma completely fills the warm, heavily insulated air of the small log cabin, acting as the absolute, perfect, final, invisible blanket of total, unwavering, and incredibly heavy relaxation, flawlessly preparing the resting mind for deep slumber. Let us gently and peacefully allow the incredibly thick, sweet ribbons of pale blue pipe smoke to continue their slow, lazy, and beautifully hypnotic ascent toward the heavily timbered ceiling, and slowly shift our tranquil attention to a deeply comforting, essential ritual of quiet, internal restoration. The immense, crushing physical toll of harvesting heavy, frozen lake ice completely demands a highly concentrated, incredibly nourishing midnight repast before the heavy, deeply exhausted body can entirely and completely surrender to the pulling gravity of sleep. Resting quietly on the absolute lowest, deeply shadowed shelf of the pale pine table is a remarkably small, perfectly flat, and beautifully irregular cutting board. This heavy little board is crafted entirely from a single solid cross-section of ancient, deeply oiled mountain walnut wood. As the cutter gently, slowly, and precisely lifts this heavy wooden board and places it completely flat upon the scrubbed surface of the pine table, the two incredibly heavy, perfectly dry woods gently meet with a remarkably soft, incredibly hollow, and deeply satisfying muffled thunk. It is a perfectly grounded, beautifully domestic sound that instantly and effortlessly beautifully anchors the weary, drifting mind. From the deep, incredibly warm, heavily insulated pocket of his thick woolen trousers, he slowly, completely silently, extracts a beautifully simple, deeply personal, and highly cherished folding pocket knife. The curved, wonderfully ergonomic handle of this small, vital tool is meticulously carved from entirely smooth, deeply polished deer antler, possessing a wonderfully organic, incredibly tactile surface perfectly mapped with tiny, naturally dark ridges and perfectly smooth, beautifully pale, highly polished valleys. With a remarkably slow, deeply deliberate, and perfectly gentle pressure of his heavily calloused thumb, he slowly opens the folding blade. The high-carbon steel gracefully and beautifully yields with an incredibly soft, deeply muffled, and highly satisfying metallic snick, perfectly locking the completely sharp, wonderfully dull grey blade flawlessly and completely into absolute unyielding position. Resting perfectly beside this smooth dark walnut board is a tiny, beautifully folded, heavily creased square of deeply oiled, entirely translucent parchment paper. With incredibly slow, remarkably gentle, and perfectly measured, unhurried movements, the cutter carefully unfolds the completely crisp, incredibly delicate corners of this quiet resting paper. The highly textured, incredibly papery rustle is exceptionally soft, a beautiful, fragile, and totally continuous whispering sound that completely and beautifully fills the breathless, insulated silence of the small log room. Nestled safely, perfectly, and entirely undisturbed within the absolute center of this completely open parchment rests a magnificent, solid, deeply aged wedge of traditional high-altitude Alpine cheese. This precious, heavily concentrated dairy treasure was meticulously crafted entirely by hand during the absolute brilliant and deeply vibrant peak of the previous summer, high up in the sun-drenched, incredibly fragrant, blooming mountain pastures. The incredibly thick, heavily natural rind of this heavy cheese is beautifully rustic, possessing a profoundly deep, dusty, slate-grey hue, completely stamped with the faint, heavily faded and beautifully dark, indented impressions of the heavy wooden aging shelves where it rested completely silently for well over a year. As the incredibly sharp, perfectly honed steel blade of the pocket knife gently and slowly presses completely down into the firm, utterly unyielding paste of the cheese, it perfectly requires a beautifully heavy, remarkably steady, and deeply deliberate downward pressure. The heavy, dense cheese flawlessly yields to the sharp metal with a wonderfully thick, incredibly soft, and profoundly satisfying heavy waxy resistance. The absolute interior of this beautiful wedge is a breathtaking, absolutely solid shade of deep, glowing, gorgeous golden yellow, beautifully resembling the perfectly preserved, completely captured, and incredibly warm light of the entirely forgotten summer sun. Scattered flawlessly, miraculously, and completely randomly throughout this incredibly dense golden paste are tiny, completely microscopic, beautifully bright white tyrosine crystals, a highly distinct, deeply beautiful, and entirely natural hallmark of profoundly slow, absolutely perfect, and entirely unhurried aging. The deeply intoxicating, wonderfully complex, and profoundly rich aroma that instantly and completely fills the warm air is incredibly heavy. It is a profoundly sweet, incredibly thick scent of beautifully browned, slowly toasted butter, completely and perfectly mingled with the deep, remarkably nutty, earthy essence of heavily roasted hazelnuts and the faint, beautifully subtle and incredibly green, sweet memory of blooming, wild mountain clover perfectly and permanently trapped forever within the heavy, golden, deeply aged milk. Placed carefully, slowly, deliberately, and perfectly adjacent to the golden resting wedge of cheese is a remarkably small, entirely solid, and incredibly dense portion of deeply traditional air-dried mountain beef. This heavy, incredibly vital winter provision is a true, undisputed masterpiece of absolute patient, completely natural preservation, having hung completely silently for countless violently freezing months in the incredibly dry, absolutely freezing, and perfectly pure alpine wind of a deeply shaded, high-altitude wooden barn. The exterior surface of this completely dried, heavy meat is incredibly dark, a profoundly deep, beautifully rich shade of heavily oxidized, almost completely black mahogany, wonderfully and entirely completely coated in a highly delicate, perfectly natural, tanned, incredibly fine dusting of completely white, entirely edible, and deeply flavorful, incredibly soft bloom. The cutter gently, perfectly, and with extreme breathtaking and deeply unhurried precision, places the very absolute edge of the heavy antler-handled knife perfectly against the dark, entirely unyielding surface of the meat, with an incredibly slow, entirely fluid, beautifully continuous, and wonderfully careful pulling motion. He completely and flawlessly shaves an impossibly thin, perfectly translucent, and incredibly delicate slice directly from the heavy dark block. As this paper-thin, incredibly fragile, and totally beautiful shaving falls beautifully, gracefully, and completely silently onto the deeply oiled dark walnut board, it perfectly catches the continuously flickering, profoundly warm, incredibly soft golden light of the ambient brass lantern. The completely shaved, perfectly exposed interior meat is a visually stunning, absolutely breathtaking, and deeply mesmerizing shade of deep, incredibly vibrant, softly glowing ruby red, flawlessly and perfectly marbled with tiny, incredibly thin, beautifully branching, and microscopic rivers of perfectly pale, beautifully creamy yellow fat. the incredible, deeply savory, completely heavy, and profoundly mouth-watering fragrance that slowly, beautifully, and gracefully rises from this perfectly paper-thin slice is incredibly concentrated. It is a profoundly rich, deeply earthy, and entirely, perfectly salty perfume, wonderfully and completely flawlessly intertwined with the incredibly sharp, beautifully clean, and highly fragrant aroma of crushed, dark mountain juniper berries and deeply pungent, perfectly cracked black peppercorns that were meticulously, deeply, and repeatedly rubbed directly into the heavy meat, completely before its long, completely silent, and profoundly freezing cure. To perfectly, beautifully, and completely balance this incredibly heavy, profoundly rich, and entirely savory midnight offering, the cutter finally, slowly, and with deep reverence reaches entirely deep into the incredibly warm, entirely dark, heavily insulated pocket of his incredibly thick, heavy navy blue overcoat. He gently, quietly, and perfectly extracts a single, remarkably small, entirely imperfect, and completely beautifully, heavily aged winter apple. This extremely humble, deeply quiet, and completely unpretentious fruit has been resting completely silently for many long, entirely dark, completely frozen months, perfectly buried completely within a completely dry, incredibly cool, and heavily insulated wooden barrel of perfectly pale, entirely soft sawdust deep inside a buried, silent mountain root cellar. The incredibly thick, naturally protective, and deeply resilient skin of this tiny apple has completely, entirely lost the bright, perfectly smooth, beautifully taut, and entirely vibrant shine of its distant, incredibly brief autumn youth. Instead, the deeply golden, wonderfully heavily russeted surface is now incredibly tough, entirely matte, and beautifully, perfectly mapped with countless completely microscopic, deeply formed, and entirely permanent wrinkles, completely resembling the incredibly soft, wonderfully pliable, deeply textured, and profoundly heavy surface of highly aged, deeply handled ancient parchment, when the incredibly sharp, beautifully dull grey, perfect steel blade of the heavy pocket knife gently, smoothly, and perfectly slices directly through this highly wrinkled, deeply yielding, heavy skin. There is absolutely no sharp, loud, violently crisp, or completely jarring snap. Instead, the incredibly dense, entirely soft, beautifully mellow, and completely mealy interior flesh gracefully and perfectly yields with a deeply muted, incredibly soft, perfectly continuous, and wonderfully deeply satisfying, incredibly quiet, papery sigh. The deeply, heavily aged flesh of this quiet, completely unassuming apple has completely, entirely lost all of its highly acidic, intensely sharp, and violently crisp bite, beautifully, flawlessly, and entirely magically completely transforming over the long, completely silent, heavy winter into an incredibly soft, profoundly, deeply honeyed, entirely sweet, and perfectly heavy, concentrated perfection. As the incredibly heavy, entirely exhausted, and deeply quiet cutter slowly, rhythmically, and perfectly partakes of these incredibly rich, wonderfully highly concentrated, entirely beautiful, and profoundly traditional heavy mountain flavors, an incredible, overwhelmingly heavy, perfectly unbroken, and deeply, completely satisfying wave of absolute, perfectly complete, entirely internal warmth, absolutely, completely, thoroughly, entirely floods his perfectly relaxed, entirely exhausted body. This deeply quiet, completely, incredibly slow, entirely, perfectly rhythmic, and profoundly peaceful midnight tasting entirely, flawlessly, and perfectly, absolutely completes the physical, entirely total restoration of the body, beautifully, entirely perfectly, and completely silently preparing the highly deeply resting, completely heavy mind to finally, completely entirely perfectly surrender completely to the deep, incredibly long, completely uninterrupted, entirely perfect, and absolutely profound sanctuary of incredibly heavy, entirely dreamless sleep. Let us now allow our deeply satisfied, completely resting senses to gently drift away from the dark walnut board and the remnants of the sweet honeyed winter apple. The midnight hour has grown immensely deep, and the absolute final preparation before total slumber can be safely embraced involves the slow, highly methodical, and beautifully quiet maintenance of the brass kerosene lantern resting upon the pine table. This simple, reliable lamp is not merely a source of artificial illumination, it is the absolute guardian of the room's sanctuary, a faithful sentinel that has kept the encroaching, freezing darkness of the vast Alpine wilderness perfectly at bay throughout the entire evening. The cutter slowly, with an incredibly gentle, unhurried movement of his heavy hands, reaches toward the warm brass base of the lamp. The metal feels comfortably warm to the touch, having absorbed the steady, constant heat of the tiny internal flame for hours. He places his large thumb and index finger precisely upon the small, knurled brass adjustment knob that projects from the side of the burner assembly. With an incredibly slow, perfectly deliberate and microscopic twist, he rotates the tiny wheel counterclockwise. Instantly, the flat, tightly woven cotton wick housed within the mechanism is drawn gently downward, descending a fraction of a millimeter into the dark reservoir below. The steady teardrop of amber light responds immediately to this delicate adjustment, shrinking softly from a bright, expansive glow into a remarkably small, intensely concentrated, and deeply soothing kernel of golden light. As the illumination within the small log cabin softens dramatically, casting long, deeply dark, and incredibly peaceful shadows across the grooved timber walls, the cutter prepares to execute a beautifully precise 19th century tradition of maintenance, trimming the wick. With absolute practiced stillness, he reaches for a pair of antique, heavily blackened iron wick shears resting in a quiet groove near the table's edge. These specialized shears are a marvel of functional, old-world craftsmanship, featuring a broad, flat, circular blade assembly specifically designed to catch the charred, spent carbon remnants of the cotton without letting them fall into the clear oil basin. The cutter carefully and silently lifts the delicate, entirely transparent glass chimney of the lantern, using a thick, dry square of linen cloth to protect his fingers from the heated glass. The metal hinges of the protective globe frame yield with an incredibly soft, completely silent movement, tilting backward with a slow, heavy grace. Now completely exposed to the open, still air of the room, the tiny naked flame flickers ever so gently, its golden light dancing beautifully across the smooth, polished deer antler handle of the pocket knife resting nearby. The cutter lifts the heavy iron shears, his fingers slipping comfortably into the wide oval finger loops. He brings the sharp, flat blades precisely to the very top of the exposed, dark cotton wick. There is absolutely no rush in this movement. Every micro-action is performed with a deeply relaxing, meditative slowdown. The blackened iron blades slowly close around the topmost, slightly uneven edge of the fibrous material. With a remarkably soft, entirely clean and deeply satisfying snip, the shears slice through the woven cotton. The sound is an incredibly muted, dry and soft clipping, a beautiful acoustic texture that perfectly breaks the deep silence of the room for a single comforting instant. This precise trimming removes the tiny, irregular carbon deposits that cause a lamp to smoke or burn unevenly, ensuring that when the wick is raised once more it will produce a perfectly flat, flawlessly symmetrical, and completely clean horizontal bar of steady amber light. The spent, dark particles are held safely within the flat cup of the shears, completely prevented from causing a single blemish upon the pristine, scrubbed surface of the pale pine table. With the wick now perfectly and flawlessly trimmed, the cutter turns his quiet, heavy attention to the delicate maintenance of the clear glass chimney itself. Over the long hours of continuous burning, an incredibly fine, nearly invisible film of pale grey carbon dust has gently gathered on the very interior top of the cylindrical glass tube. To completely restore the crystalline perfection of this fragile component, the cutter uses a beautifully soft, completely dry and heavily frayed strip of clean white flannel cloth. He gently inserts the soft cloth entirely into the hollow center of the cold glass cylinder, slowly rotating the fabric against the smooth interior surface with a remarkably steady, rhythmic and sweeping motion of his wrist. This action produces an incredibly delicate, beautifully soft, and entirely continuous whistling rustle, the unmistakable, highly soothing sound of clean cloth polishing smooth glass. It is a profoundly quiet, highly textured acoustic lullaby that perfectly matches the slow, deep, and completely relaxed rhythm of your own heavy breathing. As the soft flannel passes repeatedly over the glass, the fine carbon dust is effortlessly and completely removed, leaving the chimney entirely flawless, beautifully transparent, and completely free of any shadow or obstruction. The cutter slowly, carefully, and with the utmost reverence lowers the pristine glass chimney back down over the burner assembly, allowing the heavy metal guide rings to click softly and securely back into absolute locked position. The tiny trimmed flame, now perfectly protected once more from the subtle indoor air currents by the crystal clear glass shield, burns with an entirely new level of absolute unwavering stability. It does not flicker, it does not sway, and it produces absolutely no smoke. It simply sits perfectly still in the absolute center of the quiet room, casting a beautifully clean, deeply rich, and profoundly warm pool of pure golden amber light that stretches softly across the dark walnut board and the closed leather ledger. Looking directly at this perfectly balanced, beautifully maintained little flame introduces an overwhelming, deeply settling sense of total order, absolute security, and complete harmony to the inner spirit. Every single tool within the room has now been perfectly sharpened. Every piece of critical equipment has been meticulously maintained, and the primary light source has been beautifully optimized to guide the cabin safely through the remaining hours of the dark winter night. Finally, to transition the room completely into its ultimate sleep-inducing state, the cutter performs the absolute final act of the lamp ritual. He places his thumb once more upon the knurled brass knob, turning it counterclockwise with an incredibly slow, continuous and steady rotation. The flat cotton wick sinks deeper and deeper into the burner, and the golden flame follows it down, shrinking beautifully from a small bar into a tiny microscopic point of blue and amber light. The massive, expansive shadows that have been waiting patiently in the corners of the room instantly expand, moving forward with a slow, silent, and incredibly graceful tide to reclaim the space. The room is now bathed in a profoundly dim, deeply comforting, and ultra-soft twilight, an environment completely dominated by the rich, pulsing crimson glow of the dying embers in the stone hearth. The cutter gently blows across the top of the glass chimney, a soft, slow exhalation that completely extinguishes the final tiny point of light. Incredibly faint, sweet scent of warm, extinguishing oil rises from the lamp for a brief moment, blending perfectly with the rich, heavy aromas of the chicory root, the dried lavender, and the ancient wood smoke. The room is now perfectly, beautifully dark, saved only by the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the crimson coals. The absolute finality of this quiet ritual releases an irresistible, heavy wave of complete relaxation over the entire body, effortlessly drawing the resting mind down into the deep, dark, and unbroken embrace of total peaceful sleep. Let us allow our fully relaxed, deeply heavy senses to fully yield to the profound, velvety darkness that has now completely and beautifully claimed the interior space of the small mountain cabin. The extinguishing of the solitary brass lantern marks the absolute, definitive boundary between the world of waking labor and the infinite peaceful realm of total undisturbed rest. In this deep, womb-like twilight, illuminated exclusively by the incredibly soft, slow, and rhythmic pulsing of the crimson embers within the stone hearth, the ice cutter takes his final, slow steps toward the sleeping alcove. Every single movement is now performed with an incredibly heavy, beautifully fluid, and completely unhurried cadence, a natural physical surrender to the immense, crushing weight of exhaustion that has steadily accumulated throughout the long, freezing night. He reaches the edge of the massive spruce bed frame, his heavy woolen trousers brushing softly against the raw, hand-planed timber with a remarkably faint, deeply muted, and completely dry rustle. As he gently and deliberately lifts his weary legs, sliding them entirely beneath the heavy homespun flax sheets and the colossal winter quilt, the thick canvas mattress filled with dried summer hay responds instantly with a wonderfully deep, incredibly soft, and beautifully organic compression. It is a slow, multi-layered acoustic texturing, a long, gentle, papery crunching sound that beautifully and completely fills the silent room, sounding exactly like a quiet whisper of wind traveling through dry autumn reeds. The sensation of entering this meticulously prepared sleeping cocoon is nothing short of miraculous. The heavy homespun linen sheets, though initially feeling beautifully cool against the skin, possess an incredible, almost magical ability to instantaneously capture the very first radiant molecules of body heat within a matter of brief, unhurried moments. The interior of the bed transforms into a perfectly warm, intensely cozy, and completely breathable sanctuary that totally insulates the resting body from the vast, freezing Alpine wilderness outside. Draped generously over this comforting linen framework is the true masterpiece of traditional mountain weaving, the massive raw sheep's wool quilt. As this monumental covering is pulled slowly and smoothly up to the cutter's chin, its extraordinary physical weight immediately makes itself felt. It does not merely rest upon the body, it presses down with a deeply soothing, perfectly distributed, and immensely comforting pressure that feels exactly like a firm, permanent, and protective embrace from an old friend. This substantial, heavy gravity acts as a powerful physical anchor for the entire nervous system, instantly signaling every single overworked muscle, every strained tendon, and every racing thought to completely let go, slow down, and sink deeply into the supportive depths of the bed. The weight of the loom completely counters the pulling chill of the high-altitude midnight, locking the physical form into an unshakable state of absolute, unwavering security. As his heavy head sinks deeply and gracefully into the absolute center of the large pillow, the soft white down completely and flawlessly contours to the exact shape of his neck and tired shoulders, providing an overwhelming, luxurious sensation of weightless suspension. The tiny, hand-sewn cotton sachet of thoroughly dried purple lavender buds hidden discreetly beneath the down is gently compressed by this movement, releasing a fresh, incredibly delicate and beautifully fragrant cloud of its sweet herbal perfume directly into the cool air surrounding his face. Inhale this soothing fragrance slowly and deeply in your mind. The pure floral softness of the lavender weaves effortlessly with the deep, rich and grounding aromas that already saturate the dark room. The faint, lingering sweetness of the roasted chicory root, the waxy warmth of the conditioned leather gloves resting on the hearthstone, and the clean, purifying essence of ancient wood smoke drifting from the dying coals. This magnificent, complex sensory tapestry forms an invisible, highly protective blanket that entirely wraps around your consciousness, naturally relaxing the heavy muscles of the brow, softening the line of the jaw, and allowing your already heavy eyelids to droop completely and finally closed. Listen closely to the unique, beautiful acoustic environment that now completely defines this dark, insulated haven. Because the immense log walls are so incredibly thick, and the steep wooden roof far above is buried beneath several feet of dense, packed winter snow, the interior of the cabin has become an absolute fortress of silence, yet it is a rich, living stillness, beautifully punctuated by two distinct, highly rhythmic, and deeply comforting auditory pendulums. The first is the magnificent, crisp, and beautifully metallic ticking of the solid silver pocket watch resting entirely alone upon the dark oak mantelpiece. Its slow mechanical heartbeat, tick, 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 repeats with an unyielding, absolute precision, measuring not the frantic passage of modern time, but the deep stretching peace of the mountain night. The second sound, perfectly complementing this mechanical cadence, is the slow, deep, and beautifully steady breathing of the crimson embers within the hearth. As the invisible, microscopic drafts of the room move over the coals, they release an incredibly soft, muffled, and entirely continuous sighing sound, a gentle rhythmic pulse of radiant heat that perfectly mirrors the slow, relaxed rise and fall of your own chest. These two soothing sounds gently entwine in the darkness, creating a flawless, deeply hypnotic lullaby that effortlessly draws the mind further and further away from the waking world. Resting completely still within this timbered cocoon, entirely hidden away from the freezing universe, an overwhelming sense of profound internal peace and total closure washes completely over the spirit. There is absolutely nothing left to be done, no further preparations to be made, and no responsibilities left unfulfilled. The heavy iron tools sit perfectly sharpened and safely buckled within their soft suede pockets. The day's monumental harvest has been meticulously documented in the dark leather ledger, and the guardian flame of the brass lantern has been beautifully, safely extinguished. the entire world outside, from the flawless frozen mirror of the massive Alpine lake to the colossal slumbering granite peaks towering beneath the star-studded indigo sky, is completely at peace, moving at the deliberate, patient pace of nature itself. Wrapped safely in the permanent embrace of the heavy wool, completely insulated from the cold, and deeply anchored by the comforting weight of the quilt, you are entirely free to let go. Allow the dark, soothing rhythms of the quiet past to fully take hold of your mind. Let yourself drift slowly, beautifully, and effortlessly downward, surrendering completely to the deep, long, and entirely undisturbed sanctuary of total heavy sleep. Sleep well. Let us allow our resting minds to float gently within this profound velvety darkness, where the only visible reality is the soft, pulsing crimson glow of the dying hearth embers. As the physical body remains completely motionless, anchored by the comforting, immense gravity of the heavy woolen quilt, the consciousness begins to expand, drifting into a space of deep philosophical reflection. In this secluded high-altitude haven of 1895, time is entirely stripped of its modern frantic urgency. It does not fly or escape. Instead, it accumulates with the slow, majestic patience of the falling snow outside. We begin to contemplate the deep, silent architecture of winter time, a grand, cosmic patience that governs the slumbering mountains and the lives of those who dwell within their shadow. The ice cutter, resting peacefully in his timbered cocoon, is not merely a solitary laborer working through a freezing night. He is a quiet participant in an ancient, unbroken lineage of human adaptability. For centuries, long before the arrival of modern machinery, families in these remote valleys have listened to the exact same rhythmic ticking of the hearth fire, waiting out the long, dark seasons with a profound, unshakable faith in the natural order of the world. To modern eyes, the act of harvesting ice by hand beneath the midnight moon might seem like a fleeting temporary struggle against the elements. Yet, when viewed through the lens of history, it reveals itself as a beautiful, highly deliberate dance of absolute harmony. The ice cutter does not fight the winter, he collaborates with it. He understands that the intense, freezing cold which locks the valley in a pristine, white silence is not a hostile force, but a magnificent master craftsman, patiently purifying and solidifying the waters of the Great Lake into a flawless, crystalline treasure. This perspective transforms our understanding of the past. The 19th century was not a primitive era waiting to be corrected by the future. It was a complete, beautifully realized world that moved at the precise, unhurried cadence of the seasons. In this world, a single day was not a fragmented blur of notifications and digital distractions, but a solid, continuous block of lived experience, deeply rooted in the physical reality of the earth. The textures we have explored tonight, the rough grain of the seasoned spruce logs, the waxy smoothness of the conditioned oxhide gloves, the porous warmth of the homespun flax sheets, are the tangible markers of a lifestyle where every object possessed a clear, respected purpose, and where human hands left a lasting, meaningful imprint on everything they touched. Consider the magnificent, silent endurance of the colossal granite peaks that encircle this frozen valley. These mountain giants have stood sentinel over the lake for countless millennia, watching the slow, cyclical procession of human generations with an absolute, unblinking indifference. To them, a single winter is but a brief, microscopic blink of an eye, a temporary dusting of white across their ancient, deeply scarred faces. Yet within the sheltering warmth of the small log cabin, the ice cutter's humble, repetitive tasks carry an immense, quiet dignity that mirrors the permanence of the stone. The sharp, rhythmic scratch of the steel pen across the cotton rag ledger, the long, musical hiss of the sharpening stone against the carbon chisel, the deliberate soft packing of the briar smoking pipe. These are the small, beautiful rituals that elevate daily survival into a form of quiet, artistic expression. They are the expressions of a deep internal peace, a state of mind that completely accepts the immense scale of the wilderness and finds absolute comfort in the small, well-tended boundaries of the domestic hearth. As you lie there entirely safe and warm within this historical sanctuary, let your mind completely release the heavy burden of linear progress. In the modern world, we are constantly encouraged to look forward, to anticipate the next moment, to rush toward a distant, uncertain future. But here, in the quiet heart of 1895, the present moment is entirely sufficient. The past is not behind us, and the future is not ahead. They are both beautifully folded directly into the deep stillness of this winter midnight. The ice currently freezing on the lake has been formed from water that fell as pure rain during the forgotten summers of previous decades, slowly filtered through the deep rocky veins of the mountain before emerging into the light. The firewood smouldering so gently in the hearth was once a living tree that drank the sunlight of a century ago, patiently storing up that ancient thermal energy so that it could be released tonight, warming a room that was built by hands that have long since returned to the soil. Everything is profoundly connected in a slow, beautiful, and completely unbroken circle of existence. This realization brings a deep, overwhelming sense of comfort to the tired spirit. It reminds us that we are not isolated fragments drifting through a chaotic universe, but part of a vast, beautifully ordered tapestry of time and nature. The deep silence of the Alpine valley is not an empty vacuum. It is a rich, supportive presence, a soft cradle that safely holds the entire sleeping world. Listening to the distant, muffled thrumming of the high-altitude wind against the heavy wooden roof shingles feels like listening to the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the earth itself. It is a sound that completely disarms the mind, melting away the last remnants of modern anxiety and replacing them with a profound, unwavering trust in the safety of the night. The dark timber ceiling above your head does not feel oppressive. It feels like the protective canopy of an ancient forest, shielding you from the infinite, star-studded dark of the cosmos, and keeping you tucked securely within this tiny, glowing oasis of warmth. Let yourself sink even deeper into the supportive embrace of the hay-filled mattress, allowing your consciousness to dissolve gently into the timeless atmosphere of the room. The silver pocket watch on the oak mantel continues its crisp metallic ticking. Tick, 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 a steady, comforting reminder that within this room order and peace are absolute. The crimson coals in the hearth continue to breathe their slow, soft sighs of radiant heat, ensuring that your sanctuary remains perfectly warm and intensely cozy until the distant eventual arrival of the winter dawn. There is absolutely nothing you need to accomplish, no problems you need to solve, and no destinations you need to reach. You are entirely free to simply exist, to let go of the waking world entirely, and to allow the slow, hypnotic currents of history to carry you effortlessly downward. Let your thoughts become as light and soft as the fine grey ash gathering on the lower hearthstone, drifting lazily into the quiet shadows before fading away into complete unbroken serenity. Surrender to the beautiful gravity of the past, and let yourself fall asleep. Sleep well wrapped in the timeless peace of the mountain midnight. Sleep well. Let us allow our expanding consciousness to drift softly toward the small single window of the log cabin, where the interior amber warmth of the dying fire meets the immense, freezing reality of the Alpine night. In this quiet twilight, the intricate frost patterns growing across the hand-rolled glass pane become a profound subject for our silent meditation. These delicate structures, visible in the soft crimson glow of the hearth, are not mere accidental formations of freezing moisture. They are the exquisite temporary calligraphy of the winter spirit. Each sweeping fern-like frond and delicate icy petal curling across the surface of the glass represents a perfect mathematical order, a silent geometry that operates entirely without human intervention. To gaze upon this frozen garden, in our mind's eye, is to connect deeply with a timeless form of artistry, one that has played out on the windows of isolated shelters for thousands of years, offering a quiet visual sermon on the beauty of ephemeral creations. In the hurried modern era, we rarely find the stillness required to observe the slow, patient growth of such microscopic masterpieces. We look through windows merely to see what lies beyond, treating the glass as an invisible barrier rather than a canvas. But here, in the secluded world of 1895, the ice cutter understands that the frost on his window is a vital part of the room's living architecture. It is a protective, semi-opaque curtain that softens the harsh brilliance of the midnight moon, filtering the silver light into a gentle, cloud-like luminescence that bathes the dark timber walls in pure serenity. This microscopic detailing teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of the past, The history we are visiting tonight is not composed of grand, sweeping political movements or loud historical events. It is built from these small, overlooked moments of quiet contemplation where a solitary human being finds complete contentment in the simple act of watching the world freeze. Consider the remarkable journey of the tiny water droplets that now form this exquisite ice lace. Before they became trapped upon the glass pane, they existed as invisible vapors floating softly through the warm air of the room, carrying the sweet essence of the wild mountain chamomile, the rich aroma of the roasted chicory root, and the faint comforting smoke of the briar pipe. As they drifted toward the cold perimeter of the cabin, drawn magnetically toward the freezing glass, they did not freeze in a chaotic or rushed frenzy. Instead, they organized themselves with absolute precision, aligning their microscopic molecules along the subtle winding imperfections and tiny air bubbles trapped within the hand-poured pane. This process is a beautiful metaphor for the way our own scattered thoughts begin to settle and solidify when we enter this space of total relaxation. The chaotic, fluid energy of the waking day slowly cools, aligning itself with the deep, unshakable structures of peace and stability that define this historical sanctuary. As you rest completely still beneath the immense comforting weight of the woolen quilt, let your mind trace the elegant curves of these icy fronds. Notice how they seem to grow outwards from the corners of the window, reaching toward the center like silent crystalline vines seeking the warmth of the room. The texture of this frost is astonishingly complex, a multi-layered landscape of tiny raised ridges and hollow valleys that catch the pulsing crimson light of the hearth fire, gleaming softly like veins of pure silver embedded within dark volcanic stone. Every single crystal is perfectly unique, yet they all obey the same fundamental laws of nature, creating a harmonious, unified design that fills the quiet room with an overwhelming sense of cosmic balance. It is a design that demands absolutely nothing from your intellect, offering instead an endless, soothing fascination that gently coaxes your heavy eyelids to sink even deeper into sleep. This silent geometry of the frost reminds us of the profound, invisible networks that link our human lives to the wider natural world. The ice cutter working on the lake, the blacksmith hammering iron in the valley, the weaver operating the heavy hand loom, they are all participating in a shared narrative dictated entirely by the movements of the earth and the changing of the seasons. In this world, there is no artificial separation between humanity and nature. They are intertwined in a beautiful symbiotic relationship of mutual respect. The immense cold of the winter is not an enemy to be conquered with loud, destructive technology, but a respected seasonal visitor that brings the gift of absolute stillness, forcing the frantic pace of summer to halt entirely so that the earth can rest, regenerate, and dream beneath its heavy blanket of snow. Let yourself surrender completely to this grand seasonal rhythm, releasing the final stubborn remnants of modern urgency. Within the safe insulated walls of this dark log cabin, the passage of time has slowed to a complete crawl, beautifully synchronized with the lazy upward drift of the hearth smoke and the crisp, distant ticking of the silver pocket watch on the mantel. Tick, 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 tick. The pulsing crimson coals continue to radiate their deep, penetrating warmth, ensuring that your cocoon remains perfectly safe, intensely cozy, and completely protected from the bitter external chill. There is absolutely no need to think about tomorrow. No need to anticipate the challenges of the waking world, and no need to hold on to the burdens of the past. You are entirely permitted to let go, to dissolve into the velvety darkness of the room, and to allow the slow hypnotic beauty of this forgotten midnight to carry you effortlessly away. Let your spirit become as still and beautiful as the frozen geometry on the window pane, resting deeply and securely in the timeless, unbroken peace of the mountain sanctuary. Sleep well, dear friend, sleep well. Let us allow our resting thoughts to expand even further beyond the frosted window pane, drifting out into the immense starlit darkness where the great Alpine lake lies entirely frozen in its deep mountain cradle. In the profound stillness of this late hour, we begin to contemplate the lake not as a mere physical object or a resource to be harvested, but as a living, breathing entity that enters into a silent, ancient dialogue with the solitary ice cutter. This vast sheet of solid water, stretched out like a flawless mirror under the gaze of the Milky Way, holds the accumulated memories of the entire valley. It has witnessed the slow, rhythmic coming and going of countless winters, long before human hands ever fashioned the first iron saw or built the small log shelter on its shore. To understand the ice cutter's life is to understand this profound relationship, a connection based not on dominance or exploitation, but on a deep, meditative kinship with the freezing elements. When the ice cutter steps out onto the open expanse during the day, he does not walk with the arrogant stride of a conqueror. He moves with a careful, listening reverence, his heavy leather boots testing the surface with every slow, deliberate step. He knows that the ice speaks a language of its own, a language of subtle, low-pitched groans, deep subterranean sighs, and sharp, sudden snaps that echo through the dark water below like distant thunder. These sounds are not warnings of danger to the experienced craftsman. They are the natural breathing of the lake as it adjusts to the immense weight of the winter snow and the shifting temperatures of the high-altitude air. This dialogue between the man and the ice is a beautiful testament to a forgotten way of living, an era when human beings possessed the patience to listen to the voice of the earth and the wisdom to align their labor with its shifting moods. In our modern, fast-paced world, we have largely forgotten how to engage in this kind of deep, environmental conversation. We view nature through screens, treating it as a background for our frantic lives rather than a partner in our survival. But here, in the quiet heart of 1895, the ice cutter's entire existence is beautifully bound to the physical reality of the lake. The thickness of the crust, the clarity of the frozen crystals, the texture of the surface powder, these are the fluid paragraphs of a story that he reads with his hands and his feet every single day. This micro-focus on the immediate physical world brings an overwhelming sense of mental clarity and calm. When you spend your hours observing the slow crystallization of water, your mind naturally sheds the chaotic, fragmented anxieties of linear time, adopting instead the deep cyclical patience of the mountain winter. Consider the absolute purity of the ice that the cutter harvests from these high-altitude depths. Unlike the cloudy artificial ice produced by early mechanical factories in the smog-choked cities, this mountain treasure is completely transparent, a solid block of pure light that has been frozen slowly over weeks of undisturbed silence. If you were to hold a cube of this ice up to the lantern light, you would see no bubbles, no dirt, and no imperfections. It is a perfect crystalline manifestation of the mountain air and the glacial streams that feed the lake. This transparency is a beautiful reflection of the cutter's own inner world during these long, solitary midnights. Isolated from the loud distractions of society, surrounded only by the colossal granite peaks and the star-filled sky, his thoughts become just as clear, solid, and undisturbed as the frozen water beneath his boots. As you lie completely still within the warm, protective embrace of the sleeping alcove, let this sense of absolute clarity wash over your resting spirit. You do not need to carry the heavy, chaotic noise of the modern world into this sanctuary. Like the lake outside, which has stilled its roaring summer waves to become a perfect, unmoving mirror for the stars, your mind is entirely permitted to quiet its internal turbulence. Let the frantic thoughts of the day slowly cool, settling down into a solid, beautiful state of total equilibrium. The slow, pulsing crimson light from the hearth continues to paint the room in warm, protective shadows, creating a gentle visual rhythm that coaxes your entire physical form to loosen, soften, and yield to the heavy pulling force of sleep. This silent dialogue with the lake reminds us that true peace is not found by escaping the world, but by grounding ourselves completely within its natural rhythms. The ice cutter does not resent the freezing cold or the heavy labor. He finds a deep, quiet fulfillment in the perfection of his task. When he closes his eyes at night, his mind is filled not with worries about the future, but with the beautiful geometric patterns of the ice blocks he has cut, the rhythmic sound of the saw, and the comforting knowledge that his work is in complete harmony with the seasons. It is a lifestyle that offers an incredible, enduring lesson in the art of contentment, a reminder that a simple life well lived and deeply rooted in the soil is a masterpiece of absolute peace. Let yourself drift away on the slow, hypnotic currents of this philosophical reflection allowing your consciousness to dissolve entirely into the dark, velvety atmosphere of the cabin. The silver pocket watch on the oak mantelpiece continues its crisp, metallic heartbeat. Tick, 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 measuring out the long, beautiful hours of the winter night with absolute precision. The dying embers in the stone hearth release their final, soft sighs of radiant heat, keeping your timbered cocoon intensely cozy, perfectly safe, and completely secure from the bitter external wilderness. There is absolutely nothing left for you to do but surrender to the heavy gravity of the loom, letting your spirit sink deeply and effortlessly into the dark, undisturbed sanctuary of total, dreamless rest. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep well wrapped in the timeless embrace of the mountain midnight. Let us allow our deeply resting minds to hover gently within the absolute final moments of philosophical reflection, absorbing the profound, encompassing peace that has completely saturated every single corner of the small log cabin. As we prepare to leave the realm of conscious thought entirely behind, we pause to consider the ultimate meaning of the ice cutter's solitary existence, the quiet heritage of stillness that he inherits from the past and leaves behind for the future. In our modern, frantic world, Daisan is almost always measured by visible accumulation, by loud achievements, and by massive structures that demand the world's attention. But here, in the deeply shaded valley of 1895, we discover an entirely different form of legacy, a silent, invisible continuity that is written not in stone or gold, but in the perfect, harmonious alignment of human life with the slow, majestic movements of the earth. The blocks of pure, crystal-clear lake ice that the cutter has harvested tonight will eventually travel far down into the warm, distant valleys, carried carefully on heavy wooden horse-drawn sleds through the winding mountain passes. They will cool the kitchens of sleeping towns, preserve the milk of distant dairy farmers, and soothe the fevers of forgotten people who will never know the name of the solitary craftsman who worked beneath the midnight moon to secure their comfort. This anonymity is not a tragedy. It is a beautiful, deeply comforting truth. It represents a lifestyle entirely free from the heavy, anxious burden of individual ego. The ice cutter does not labor to be remembered. He labors because his work is necessary, because it is beautifully synchronized with the seasons, and because it provides a quiet, vital service to the world. When his ice completely melts away in the warmth of the coming spring, returning its pure water back to the soil and the rushing rivers, his labor leaves absolutely no scar upon the landscape, returning the valley to its original pristine state of untouched wilderness. To modern minds, this concept of a temporary melting legacy might seem completely foreign, yet it offers a profound, deeply settling lesson in the art of ultimate surrender. It reminds us that our own lives do not need to be a constant, frantic struggle to leave a permanent mark upon a changing world. We are permitted to be like the winter snow, to arrive softly, to wrap the world in a brief, beautiful blanket of absolute peace, and then to fade away gracefully when the season changes, trusting entirely that the natural cycle of life will continue its majestic procession without our desperate intervention. This realization releases the absolute final knots of tension trapped deeply within your tired spirit, allowing your mind to shed its remaining worries about significance, progress, and control, and to embrace the beautiful total sufficiency of the present moment. Look around the dark room one final time in your mind's eye, noting how every single element has now transitioned into a state of absolute unmoving equilibrium. The heavy iron tools, coated in their protective film of golden linseed oil, sleep silently within the soft suede pockets of the leather roll, perfectly prepared for a future that requires absolutely no thought tonight. The dark leather ledger sits completely flat upon the pale pine table, its cotton rag pages holding the permanent, dry ink of a completed duty. The brass lantern stands dark and quiet, its guardian flame completely extinguished to allow the rich, velvety shadows of the mountain night to fully reclaim their rightful sanctuary. The entire cabin has become an absolute temple of restorative rest, a protected cocoon where the chaotic noise of human civilization is entirely muted, replaced by the deep, ancient silence of the slumbering granite peaks. As you lie there completely motionless beneath the immense comforting weight of the raw sheep's wool quilt, let yourself feel a profound sense of gratitude for this journey into the quiet past. By stepping backward into the year 1895, you have completely decoupled your consciousness from the rapid, exhausting frequencies of the modern era. You have allowed your breath to synchronize with the slow simmer of the copper kettle, your heart to align with the crisp ticking of the silver pocket watch, tick, 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 and your spirit to rest within the deep protective architecture of the timbered alcove. You have discovered that true comfort does not come from artificial conveniences, but from the simple, honest textures of the earth and the willingness to let your mind slow down to match the patient pace of nature. The pulsing crimson embers within the stone hearth are now growing beautifully dim, their bright orange cores slowly covered by a soft, insulating blanket of fine grey ash. The radiant heat they release is incredibly gentle now, a slow, fading wave of pure warmth that tenderly strokes your face, coaxing your already heavy eyelids to completely lock shut. The external world, from the flawless frozen mirror of the massive lake to the star-scattered expanse of the indigo sky, is completely at peace, wrapped in a deep, dreamless winter hibernation. There is absolutely nothing left for you to analyze, nothing left to remember, and nothing left to anticipate. The philosophical journey is perfectly complete, and the threshold of deep restorative slumber is standing wide open before you. Let your remaining thoughts dissolve completely into the dark, velvety atmosphere of the room, like tiny sparks vanishing silently into a midnight chimney. Surrender entirely to the heavy pulling force of gravity, and let yourself float effortlessly downward into the long, dark, and unbroken sanctuary of total blissful sleep. Sleep well, dear friend, sleep well. Let us now gently surrender the very last remnants of our conscious thoughts, allowing the mind to drift like a weightless feather floating down through the deep, velvety darkness of the quiet cabin. The long, slow journey through the frozen valley of 1895 has reached its ultimate, most peaceful destination. Every historical detail we have carefully explored, every grounding texture we have softly touched, and every rich aroma we have deeply inhaled is now beginning to beautifully blend and dissolve into a singular vast ocean of absolute serenity. The room around you has grown profoundly still, wrapped in a protective dark blanket that completely isolates your resting form from the passage of worldly time. You are entirely safe, entirely warm, and entirely free to let go of the waking world, sinking deeper and deeper into the supportive embrace of the heavy hay-filled mattress. Look into the dark space behind your closed eyelids, where the external world has ceased to exist. The brilliant, star-studded sky that arches so majestically over the frozen Alpine lake is now merely a distant, fading memory. The colossal granite peaks, standing in their eternal winter silence, have gently withdrawn into the deep shadows of your mind, leaving behind only their immense sense of unshakable stability and permanent security. You are anchored to the earth, grounded by the comforting heavy gravity of the raw sheep's wool quilt that presses so evenly down upon your resting body. This substantial weight continues to act as a powerful physical lullaby, gently coaxing every single nerve, every tired muscle, and every lingering thought to completely release its hold and yield to the overwhelming pull of deep sleep. Listen to the absolute ringing silence of this dark mountain sanctuary, a stillness so rich and deep that it feels like a physical presence cradling your spirit. Within this vast quiet, the subtle, rhythmic acoustic markers of the room are slowly, beautifully softening, growing more distant with every peaceful breath you take. The crisp, metallic ticking of the solid silver pocket watch resting on the oak mantelpiece, tick, 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 no longer measures the passing of hours. It has transformed into a slow, hypnotic pulse, a steady, reliable heartbeat that perfectly echoes the long, deep, and relaxed rhythm of your own breathing. The sound seems to expand and fade, swinging gently back and forth in the warm air, drawing your consciousness further and further away from the shores of awareness. In perfect harmony with this mechanical pendulum, the dying crimson embers within the stone hearth release their final microscopic size of radiant heat. The glowing coals are now almost completely buried beneath a thick velvet soft layer of protective grey ash, their bright orange cores pulsing so slowly, so gently, that they resemble the rhythmic breathing of a creature in a deep, undisturbed hibernation. The warmth they emit is no longer a localized heat, but a soft ambient cloud that entirely blankets the room, keeping your timbered cocoon intensely cozy and perfectly secure. As the light of the fire continues to dim, transitioning into a state of total restful darkness, the long shadows that dance across the grooved spruce walls slowly merge together, dissolving the boundaries of the room into a seamless expanse of pure, comforting twilight. Imagine your thoughts becoming exactly like the fine, powdery ash gathering on the lower hearthstone. They are light, completely weightless, and entirely devoid of any form or urgency. They drift lazily through the warm interior air, turning slowly in the dark before settling quietly down into absolute nothingness. There is absolutely nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to analyze, and nothing you need to sustain. The dark leather ledger is closed, the iron tools are safely buckled away, the guardian flame of the lantern is extinguished, the labor of the past is entirely complete, and the future is a distant, unwritten country that requires absolutely none of your attention tonight. You exist exclusively in this single, perfect, and stretching moment of absolute closure. Let yourself float downward, slipping effortlessly beneath the surface of conscious thought like a drop of water returning to a deep, silent well. The air you inhale is remarkably clean and profoundly calming, carrying the faintest ghostly memories of the dried purple lavender buds, the sweet mountain chamomile, and the rich roasted chicory root. This fragrant cloud settles deep within your lungs, melting away the very last knots of internal tension and causing your jaw to completely relax, your brow to completely soften, and your spirit to completely yield. You are drifting now, moving with a slow, beautiful, and completely irresistible current that carries you away from the waking world and toward the infinite sanctuary of deep, dreamless rest. As the external world fades entirely into oblivion, the heavy timber ceiling above your head seems to expand, becoming as vast and protective as the midnight sky itself. It shields your sleeping form from every harsh reality, creating an impenetrable fortress of peace where you can safely surrender your consciousness without a single care. The distant, muffled thrumming of the high-altitude wind against the heavy roof shingles has died away into absolute silence, leaving the valley in a state of perfect, undisturbed equilibrium. Everything is still, everything is quiet, everything is exactly as it should be in the deep heart of the winter night. Allow the soothing, repetitive rhythms of this timeless sanctuary to take complete and final hold of your mind. Let yourself sink, let yourself fade, let yourself dissolve into the velvety darkness that surrounds you. There is no resistance, no friction, and no effort required. You are simply falling slowly, beautifully, and deeply into the long, dark, and unbroken embrace of total, blissful slumber. Trust the safety of the night, lean into the comforting weight of the heavy wool, and let yourself go completely. Let the past hold you, let the silence wrap you, and let the deep peace of the mountain midnight carry you all the way into sleep. Rest now, dear friend, rest deeply. Sleep, sleep. Let the final boundary between the world of form and the realm of endless rest completely wash away now, as we sink into the absolute undisturbed heart of the deep winter night. The small cabin in the year 1895 has performed its beautiful protective duty with absolute perfection. It has gathered you into its thick wooden walls, warmed you with the deep memories of ancient forest trees, and insulated your resting mind from the vast, freezing expanse of the high-altitude wilderness. Now, the interior of the room has reached a state of total, unyielding tranquility where even the shadows have ceased their slow movement, becoming a single velvety canvas of pure, comforting darkness that entirely wraps around your physical body like a protective cocoon. You are floating now, completely detached from the linear progression of time and the heavy, exhausting demands of the waking world. The slow, rhythmic rising and falling of your chest has become the primary cadence of the room, a deep, organic tide that perfectly matches the quiet hibernation of the sleeping earth outside. The heavy canvas mattress filled with dry summer hay holds your physical form in a state of perfect, unshakable support, while the monumental weight of the raw sheep's wool quilt presses down with an incredibly even, deeply soothing pressure that completely grounds your nervous system. Beneath this comforting gravity, Every remaining molecule of tension completely melts away, dissolving into the dark, warm air like morning mist vanishing above a quiet mountain stream. Listen to the absolute fading of the room's final auditory markers. The crisp, metallic ticking of the solid silver pocket watch on the oak mantelpiece. Tick, tick, tick has grown incredibly distant, sounding like a soft, echoing whisper from a long-forgotten century. It no longer speaks of minutes or hours, but of an infinite stretching peace that has no beginning and no end. The sound slowly recedes into the background of your consciousness, becoming lighter and softer with every breath you take, until it is completely swallowed by the magnificent, ringless silence of the insulated log walls. The crimson embers in the stone hearth have fully surrendered their bright orange light, covered entirely by a thick, beautiful blanket of fine grey ash that traps the last residual warmth deep within the stones, ensuring your sanctuary remains intensely cozy until the distant dawn. In this perfect, sacred darkness, your thoughts have become completely weightless, losing their sharp edges and turning into soft, drifting snowflakes that float lazily through the vast, empty spaces of your mind. They do not seek a destination, they do not carry a purpose, and they require absolutely no effort to sustain. They simply glide through the quiet twilight, spinning slowly in the breathless air before winking silently out of existence, leaving behind a flawless landscape of untouched, pristine white silence. The ledger of your day is entirely closed. The tools of your labor are safely put away. The world is completely at peace, and you are entirely permitted to dream. Imagine your spirit drifting gently outward from the small cabin, floating effortlessly over the vast frozen mirror of the colossal Alpine lake. The entire valley below is sleeping beneath a heavy, protective mantle of pure winter powder, completely undisturbed by any human presence. The massive granite peaks tower silently beneath the dark velvet canopy of the indigo sky, their jagged ridges gleaming faintly under the cool, eternal light of a million distant stars. This infinite white landscape is a place of absolute purity, a world that moves at the deliberate, patient pace of nature itself, entirely insulated from the rushed frequencies of modern civilization. To drift across this silent valley is to experience the ultimate liberation of the soul, a state of total peace where you are completely unified with the stillness of the earth. Let yourself sink deeper and deeper into this infinite white sleep, surrendering your entire consciousness to the quiet currents of the past. The air surrounding your face is remarkably cool and clean, carrying the absolute final ghostly trace of the dried lavender buds and the sweet mountain chamomile, a faint herbal lullaby that effortlessly coaxes your heavy eyelids to lock completely shut for the remainder of the long night. You are entering a realm of deep, dreamless restoration, a safe, protected sanctuary where your body can completely rebuild its strength, completely quiet its doubts, and completely renew its spirit within the timeless embrace of the mountain midnight. There is absolutely nothing left for you to accomplish, nothing left for you to remember, and nothing left for you to anticipate. Every responsibility of the waking world has been beautifully and completely fulfilled. The darkness around you is not an empty void, but a rich, nurturing presence, a soft maternal cradle that safely holds your spirit as you drift further and further away from the shores of awareness. You are falling now, falling slowly, beautifully, and effortlessly downward into the long, dark, and entirely unbroken sanctuary of total blissful slumber. Lean fully into the supportive gravity of the bed, allowing yourself to become completely anonymous, completely still, and completely at rest. Let the silence wrap you, let the warmth hold you, and let the deep peace of 1895 carry you all the way into the deep ocean of sleep. The world outside is quiet. The fire inside is dark. The sanctuary is absolute rest now, dear friend. Rest, completely yield to the beautiful darkness. Let yourself go. Sleep, sleep, sleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Wesley, your personal sanctuary of ancient tales. Here, we blend authentic historical events with gentle AI technology to recreate immersive, soothing journeys through time. This channel is crafted specifically for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. For your safety, please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, close your eyes and let history carry you into a peaceful sleep.